Love can be like a roller coaster. It twists and turns without a moment's notice.
When you in love, love make you do some crazy things.
Part of the thrill is the danger if something goes wrong.
It's like a battery. So with the battery, opposites attract.
It appeared that the common denominator was the violence.
But once you start the ride, you're in it until the end.
You letting somebody entice you to do something that you probably didn't want to do, you're messed up.
Her desire to please her man resulted in loss of life, damage, and fear and chaos.
And if you don't buckle up, someone will get hurt. March 24th, 2019, Columbus, Georgia. Located 90 minutes south of Atlanta, Columbus is a place where residents can taste suburbia without skipping the thrills of city life.
Living in Columbus, Georgia is like living in your own hometown, you know, just growing up around the same people that you've been around all your life.
Life has changed since I grew up here. It was a very quaint, quiet town, but it's gotten very, very bad here in Columbus.
On Sunday morning around 1:30 a.m., a disturbing call comes into 911 dispatch.
Police receive a call about a shooting on Winston Road at Park Place Apartments.
Despite Columbus having its fair share of rough neighborhoods, Winston Road is considered a safe haven in the city.
The area of Winston Road is a fairly upscale area, so it would be fairly unusual for a crime, let alone a gunshot victim, to be reported in this area. Law enforcement was able to respond pretty rapidly.
At the scene, bystanders point first responders to a truck that appears abandoned.
After the police arrive, they observe a deceased man in a pickup truck. It appears that the victim had only been shot once, but that the wound was fatal. The shot had to be from close range based on the burn marking. Police only found one shell casing at the scene, and it was believed that the weapon used was from a 9mm pistol.
As detectives begin to process the scene, they are able to establish the victim's identity.
The crime unit at the scene was able to pull the victim's wallet from his pants and determined that the deceased man is 30-year-old Philip Whitaker.
Luckily for detectives, it appeared that the victim's cell phone was also still in the vehicle. This is an important clue because it might provide detectives with the idea of who Philip was talking to or who he was with prior to the murder. So that phone is collected and sent for analyzing.
Now, detectives are wondering who wanted Philip dead.
As detectives start to question people at the scene, they learned that around 1 a.m., witnesses heard shouting from outside. It sounded like two men were arguing over money. One man was wearing a mask, and one witness saw the masked man pull out a gun and shoot Philip. The masked man then jumped into a gold Buick that was driven by a woman, and then they fled the scene.
Perhaps this was an armed robbery that had gone terribly wrong.
Philip had no money in his wallet, so investigators feel that whoever did this may have stolen the money that was in his wallet.
Because Philip was found inside the truck, detectives believe that he likely wasn't killed instantly by the gunshot wound, and that perhaps he entered the vehicle to drive away. But he was unable to, and then died shortly after.
Detectives contact Philip Whitaker's family to inform them of the terrible tragedy. Upon hearing the news, Philip's cousin, Gabrielle Harris, drives to the location of where Philip's body was discovered. She identifies his body.
That was a very emotional day for me because he was my favorite cousin. We didn't know how or what happened, and we was going to get to the bottom of that, but at that time we was just trying to inform other family members of what happened.
Gabrielle then calls her mom, Sabrina.
She had reached out and she called us and she said, "Mom," and she was crying real hard, and I'm like, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And she said, "They just found Philip dead," and I was like, "What?"
Philip's girlfriend, Amanda Frazier, finds out about his murder later that morning.
6, 7 o'clock in the morning, my sister came banging on my door. She was like, your baby daddy is, he gone, he dead. She just kept saying, I was like, who? So I went on social media and I just seen a whole bunch of R.I.P. Philip, R.I.P. Migo, all that, whatever. So that's how I knew it was real.
Philip Whitaker had a personality that attracted people.
Well, he had a heart of gold. Now, that I can say. He had a big heart. He'd give you the shirt off his back. He was one of those type people.
Philip was very free-hearted, and so whatever he had, he'd share it, with you.
Philip was a family man through thick and thin.
One thing I can say about Philip, he loved family. He loved his family on his mom's side and on his dad's side, and he would love to see them happy.
Philip's kind heart is what attracted his girlfriend, Amanda.
He was riding past my house, and my sister started flirting with his friend, and we all started riding together, and we never thought that we was gonna be talking or in a relationship. We became best friends.
Philip and Amanda had an on-again, off-again relationship throughout the years, but that all changed in 2011 when Amanda became pregnant with his baby.
Philip was nonchalant. He didn't talk. He didn't really open up. It took a lot for me to get something, just a small conversation out of Philip. He started talking more, let me in more. He was happy to be a daddy. I ain't never seen a side of him like that before, so that's what I mean when I say he opened up more.
When Philip was 22 years old, Amanda gave birth to their daughter, Sabrina.
He was so happy when he first seen Sabrina.
Being a father changed Philip.
He did everything he can for her, or he went over and beyond for her. I can say that. And I was excited for him.
Philip wanted to give his daughter the perfect life.
Last time I see him, I think was he had took me to the store and bought me a lot of stuff.
He was aspiring to one day build a house and, just, be a family man.
But now, just hours after Philip has been brutally murdered, police are left wondering why.
Detectives on the scene start kicking the tires on theories about what happened, and then they do a background check in their own system about Philip, just to see if he is known by police. They learn that Philip has a criminal record for selling marijuana, so this becomes a launching pad for police. They feel that Philip might be the victim of a drug deal gone bad.
And because Philip sold marijuana, he was known to carry cash.
Growing up, he always had money.
Well, he only sold marijuana because, that's a way to feed the family. He didn't believe in, working a 9-to-5, quick money. He felt like that was the quickest way to, feed his family.
Philip's family is frustrated by the lack of communication from the Columbus Police Department.
No one reached out to nobody. So I think I'm just gonna have to take it upon myself to reach out to them and see what they're gonna do. But we need to get on the ball because this don't make sense. It's like, don't nobody know nothing.
But unbeknownst to Philip's family, detectives already have a key suspect in the murder. At the police station, forensic investigators have processed Philip's cell for information.
When police analyze his cell phone, they find a very important clue. In Philip's messages, there's a correspondence from a woman named Sheree Threadgill. The message is sent around midnight, which is 90 minutes before the police think the murder occurred. And it looks as if Sheree was looking to buy marijuana from Philip.
Was Sheree responsible for Philip's murder, or was something else in play?
When we had posted the messages that Philip and her had, we had posted it on Facebook or whatever like that, and as soon as we posted that, it's like people started sharing them. And here we got 2-3 people from this side of town saying, oh, that same person tried me like that. She tried me like that. Another girl, she tried me. It was saying that she was going around doing a couple of people, trying to get a couple of people like that.
The death of local resident Philip Whitaker has left his family burdened by heartache. But just one day after his murder, information surfaces about a suspect who may be involved in the shooting.
In any investigation, you follow the evidence. So in this case, police have Philip's cell phone. And in that phone was a message from Sheree Threadgill. Police know that Sheree had messaged Philip 90 minutes prior to his murder to buy weed. So naturally, she becomes the main suspect in the case.
Police want to know what kind of relationship did Philip have with Sheree. According to the information they find on his phone, it seemed as if Sheree and Philip were more than acquaintances.
Philip had an on and off relationship with Amanda, who was the mother of his children. In his off moments, he would entertain the company of other women. One of these women happened to be Sheree Threadgill.
On the night of Philip's murder, Sheree messaged Philip several times. The messages were flirty, and she seemed determined to meet Philip to buy weed.
He would have not had pulled up to meet nobody past midnight like that. So that's why I was like, maybe they had
Police decide to check with Philip's family to see if there was a sexual relationship between the two.
If they went together, the family never met her, as far as I know.
Detectives aren't sure if Philip was romantically involved with Sheree or if she was simply a customer. Luckily, Philip's family has already started their own investigation into the matter.
So Philip lives in a community that doesn't trust the police, and people certainly don't openly speak to them. So his family takes matters into their own hands, and in a way, they act as private investigators. One of his family members manages to get Sheree Threadgill's phone number.
Philip's cousin niece Sheely calls Sheree on the phone.
Somehow, my homegirl, she got the number to the girl, and we gave her a call. She was stumbling over words. She was backpedaling, trying to explain what happened. Philip got out the car to make the sale, and when he did that, supposedly when he threw the marijuana in her car, somebody with a ski mask came and told him to give it up. And when he told Philip to give it up, Philip was just like, it's in her car.
Sheree says that the masked man shot Philip, and she was forced to drive away to save herself.
She sounded nervous. She then said, I don't want to get in trouble for buying weed. And at that point, we like, this is a whole homicide. They not stunned what you bought. So she was just like, I don't want nobody to think that I had nothing to do with it. We didn't say that. We asked him what happened.
Philip's family tell police about the strange interaction with Sheree on the phone.
In Sheree's own words, a masked man shot Philip. And police know that Sheree had arranged the meeting to buy weed. So police want to know about Sheree. Who is she? What is her background? Who does she run with? And because it's 2019, they get a lot of this information from her social media account.
After detectives scour her social media accounts, they learn that Sheree is 20 years old and has a young child.
Sheree was a young mom, and it appeared that the father wasn't in the picture to raise the young child.
We don't know much about Sheree as a mother. Based on her social media photos, it appears that she was happy to be a mom. She had pictures of smiling while pregnant and smiling while holding a baby. She appeared happy.
Police also learn that Sheree is in a relationship with an 18-year-old man named Jalen Benton.
Sheree, she met Jalen. She was a few years his senior. However, his charisma and charm drew her in like a moth to a flame.
Jalen was raised primarily by his uncle, who worked at the military base in town. Seemed to be an ordinary kid from what they can tell. Didn't get into much trouble, was good looking.
Jalen and Sheree have only been dating a few months, but the relationship seemed serious.
Jalen's ego was likely inflated due to Sheree being an older woman and all of the attention that she was willing to give him. Sheree positioned herself to be inseparable. As time went on, if you saw one, you would see the other.
But it seems as if money became an issue in their relationship.
They don't have wealthy families, they don't have good jobs. So like in any relationship, a lack of stable income becomes a roadblock in their romantic connection.
As police continue to get information on Sheree and Jalen, they learn that neither one has a substantial criminal record.
Police do a background check on Sheree. It comes back clean. And the same goes for Jalen, and nothing stands out. He has no lengthy criminal history, nothing to the level of committing a homicide.
But looks can be deceiving. Police have to locate Sheree and Jalen and question them.
Police get a known address for Sheree. It's her mom's house in town, not too far from where Philip was murdered. And they go there, and Sheree's mom is there. And the mom comes right out and says, Sheree and Jalen have skipped town, which sounds a bunch of alarms because if they had nothing to do with this, why would they leave?
When detectives check DMV records, they realize that a gold sedan is registered in Sheree's name. It's the same type of vehicle that witnesses saw at the crime scene when Philip was murdered.
Detectives don't know to what extent Sheree is involved in Philip's murder, but they know she's involved. They put an APB out on that vehicle because they have the tag number. Now the detectives want to locate her as fast as possible. And more importantly, they want to learn more about Jalen to see if he's involved as well.
There is no telling where the couple could be.
From a police perspective, you have to center the entire investigation around these two individuals because this is all they have to go on.
Then, March 25th, just one day after Philip Whitaker was killed, an armed robbery in nearby Phoenix City, Alabama, raises concerns.
There was some chatter of an incident that occurred. An individual had actually been shot, but they survived the shooting.
The suspects were seen driving a gold Buick. Cameras were able to catch the tags on this Buick, and this sets off all kinds of alarms.
Investigators have a murder in one state and a shooting in another, but are these two events related? It's been less than 24 hours since Philip Whitaker was murdered, and police are on the lookout for a couple of lovers who might have murder on the mind. 18-year-old Jalen Benton and 21-year-old Sheree Threadgill are now believed to be involved in a robbery in Alabama.
There's a river that separates Columbus and Phoenix City. They suspected them to have armed robbed a Waffle House there, where shots were actually fired inside the business.
The armed robbers were described as a black male and female couple between the ages of 18 and 25 years old. According to the reports, the two perpetrators tried to rob a woman inside the restaurant.
They were trying to get her purse, and she fought. And in the process of that, she was shot in the leg.
One of the perpetrators pulled out a pink pistol, which of course is a very unique color for a weapon, especially one that's being used in a crime.
Detectives working the scene in Phoenix City radio all surrounding police departments and tell them to be on the lookout for an armed and dangerous couple driving a gold Buick.
Communication between police departments is so important today. Within seconds, multiple jurisdictions were communicating to each other about these individuals. And as a result, some connections were made.
It was believed because the tag on the vehicle and the vehicle make and model and everything was starting to add up.
It seems as if Jalen and Sheree's crime spree is escalating with each passing hour.
One of the tactics police lean on here is help from the public.
News about Sheree and Jalen's crime spree hits the local news.
They know Sheree and Jalen are armed and extremely dangerous. So it's all hands on deck at this point.
Philip Whitaker's family is in a state of shock when they learn about the additional crimes.
We were just seeing stuff on Facebook that, Facebook crime, they was posting things that the crimes that they was committing along the way. Why are y'all doing this? That's the question that I still have to this day. Why did y'all do this?
They were on the run and they needed money to survive, which makes them more dangerous. There's no telling what they'll do next.
On March 25, 2019, at approximately 7:37 p.m., the Meridian Police Department is dispatched to a restaurant.
Meridian, Mississippi is about 4 hours west of Columbus. It's essentially on the border of Alabama and Mississippi.
According to the reports, a brazen armed robbery had just been committed by a masked couple.
The investigators immediately called my cell phone to let me know that a armed robbery of a business had just occurred.
When Officer Ratliff starts his investigation, one key witness statement stands out. Like in the restaurant robbery, a gold sedan is at the center of the crime.
The car had not quite pulled up to the window yet. And once the employee opens the window because the car is coming, he produces 2 handguns and jumps through the window. They were all scared to death. He came through with guns drawn, pointed at them.
And there is one more key piece of evidence in the case. The perp was brandishing a pink pistol. Officer Ratliff checks in with surrounding police departments to see if any other robberies were committed by an assailant with a pink 9mm.
Hey, what kind of gun, what color was the gun that he used in the armed robberies? Every single one of them said pink. It was just the telltale signs that, yeah, we got our guy.
When it was all said and done, the entire robbery lasted only a few minutes, and no one was hurt.
If you are so desperate for money that you are willing to jump through a drive-through window with a gun, there's really no telling how far you will go.
Police are still unable to apprehend Sheree and Jalen, but based on their robberies, they suspect the couple is heading west.
The first crime was the murder of Philip Whitaker in Columbus, Georgia. Then they head west and do a quick stop in Phoenix City, Alabama. And then they hit Meridian, which is 4 hours west of Columbus. So these two are certainly establishing a pattern. They weren't changing the car. They weren't changing the weapons they were using. These were clearly inexperienced criminals.
Police departments throughout Mississippi are alerted to be on the lookout for a gold sedan. For now, police can only play the waiting game. 2 hours west of Meridian is the peaceful town of Vicksburg, Mississippi.
We are right on the Mississippi River on I-20, right at the Louisiana-Mississippi line. The sheriff's office and the police department work together, hand in hand, to try to keep crime down. Most of our crime is property crime.
But their quiet town is about to be turned upside down. At 9:47 p.m., while on patrol, Officer Keys spots a gold sedan driving on Highway 61.
I knew it was the suspect vehicle from the armed robberies.
Officer Keys initiates a stop near a gas station.
They pull over on the shoulder between the 2 entrances. I pull in behind them off the road. I knew that they were armed, and that's the reason I waited on backup when I first stopped them, just to make sure that we had more numbers than they did.
Then, Officer Keys' life changes forever. Just one day after the murder of Philip Whitaker, police in Vicksburg, Mississippi believe they have their suspects cornered.
We had them out of our community before they hurt somebody here. If they're willing to jump through a fast food restaurant with a gun, they're pretty much willing to do anything.
Officer Keys knows the suspects are armed and dangerous, so he waits for backup. But Sheree and Jalen aren't in the mood to wait. They exit the car and Jalen begins shooting at Officer Keys.
I was able to see the muzzle flash, see everything. Have no idea where that round went to. The Circle K was full of people and vehicles at the time.
Officer Keys takes cover behind his squad car.
Despite getting shot at, Deputy Keys does not return fire to ensure the safety of the civilians in the area.
Jalen and Sheree run on foot. They aren't going down without a fight.
Jalen and Sheree are desperate at this moment. There's really nothing else to do other than run. So what do? They commandeer a vehicle and they take hostages.
A mother is picking her daughter up from work.
She had pulled up to pick up her daughter from work, and the next thing she knew, there was people jumping in her vehicle. A gun was pointed at the back of her head.
Sheree and Jalen take off in the stolen vehicle with one hostage driving and the other in the front seat.
Now we have 2 hostages, so a lot of our playbook is taken from us. We can't ram the vehicle because we've got two suspects as well as at least 2 hostages in the car.
Officer Keys stays in hot pursuit of the stolen vehicle.
I jumped ahead of the pursuit with a spike strip in an attempt to flatten the tires on the vehicle in a safe manner and get the vehicle to stop.
I believe they were trying to get across the bridge to Louisiana, as we are right there.
But in a shocking turn of events, the stolen vehicle avoids the spike strip by making a U-turn on the highway. Then, to everyone's surprise, the vehicle comes to a complete stop.
The mom threw the vehicle in park and they jumped out. The sheriff stopped with them and confirmed that yes, these are the only 2 hostages and that nobody else except for the 2 suspects are in the vehicle.
Officer Martin Pace, who was also in pursuit, is tasked with getting information from the surviving hostages.
She was able to give us good information very quickly that I was able to relay to the other units. She was able to tell us who was in what position, who had the gun.
According to the hostage, Sheree is driving the vehicle, and Jalen is in the front passenger seat with a loaded gun. With the hostages now safe, Officer Keys attempts to end the chase once and for all.
I aimed at the driver's side tire and tried to shoot it out.
After an hour-long pursuit, the stolen vehicle comes to a complete stop. But is the fight over?
The suspects were about to come out and engage us in gunfire.
Jalen Benton and Sheree Threadgill seem to be at the end of their road.
I remember coming out, moving to the passenger side of my vehicle. The sheriff was to my right, and I was drawn down and dead on the passenger door.
Officer Keys knows anything can happen. The doors open, and Officer Keys steadies his aim.
The female driver come out first. She come out unarmed, and the officers to my left started talking to her, calling her out, taking her into custody.
The 2 peacefully exit the vehicle after causing so much pandemonium throughout multiple states.
The saga is over. Sheree and Jalen are finally in police custody.
He went in the back of my patrol car. He really didn't say anything. He was just there. I'd been shot at earlier that night. After everything settled, after my adrenaline dump, there on scene after taking them in custody and everything was settled down, I was there, but I wasn't there.
As for Philip Whitaker's family, they are relieved to hear that Sheree and Jalen have been apprehended.
The detective reached out and let us know that they was captured, and this is how they was captured.
The next morning, about 6:30, I received a call from Martin Pace, the sheriff in Morgan County. It said, hey, we have the suspects. Would I like to take the lead in the investigation?
Agent Ratliff and the Warren County detectives decide to interrogate Sheree first.
She was really stoic as far as that. She said that she lived in Columbus with Jalen, but didn't really dive into where they stopped and whatnot.
As I was in there listening, I could tell that she would kind of play off with the information that was being provided to her by the FBI, and then she would kind of downplay that a little bit, but she wouldn't deny it, she just wouldn't go into it.
I don't think she was protecting Jalen. I think she was protecting herself in a way, because she really wasn't telling off on herself, because she was really a part of the crimes as well.
With Sheree staying tight-lipped, Agent Ratliff shifts his attention towards Jalen.
So Jalen was very stoic as well, very standoffish, didn't really want to talk about much. We started talking about Sheree. and how much Sheree loved him, how their relationship looked like really secure because they had committed all these crimes together, and it seemed like they had a good relationship.
Jalen starts to loosen up.
He seemed almost protective of her. They both were equally responsible for their actions.
Jalen gave us detailed information that only him and her would know. And once we gave Sheree that tidbit of information, maybe just a little bit, that only them two knew, and Sheree knew that Benton had told us everything, she came out and started telling us everything.
Sheree tells detectives how the murder of Philip Whitaker went down.
She was going to meet him, buy some marijuana. She stated that this was someone that she knew and that Jalen wanted to rob him. She said that she told him that he typically didn't have money on him, just marijuana, but Jalen still wanted to rob him. So she facilitated the buy. She said that he gave her the marijuana and Jalen came up with the firearm. And Jalen told him, give me all you got, give me all you got. And she said that this individual had already went back to the truck and that Jalen just shot him. And then came and got in the vehicle and they took off.
The confession doesn't end with the murder of Philip Whitaker. Sheree starts to confess to crimes that the authorities don't even know about.
She admitted to everything. The murder in Columbus, all of the armed robberies, which I think it was about 10 of them, that they committed from Georgia to Brandon, Mississippi.
Soon after Sheree comes clean, Jalen confesses as well.
He confessed to each individual crime. That alone was important to itself, but he had specific details that, were not fraud or forged. Like, yeah, we went here at this time. We went here this day. We did this, drove here, and stopped at these places where we robbed.
Sheree may have been guilty of standing by her man, but Jalen clearly was capable of violence.
It sounds like to me it was a lot of manipulation in the beginning. He may have portrayed an image that he had more than what he possibly had, which kind of captivated her and kept her attention. And so once she had drawn her in with the manipulation, she was kind of stuck based off the intimacy that had occurred between them. And as time went on, she had tunnel vision. And with the tunnel vision, you don't look at what's right, you don't look at what's wrong. Typically, you just continue to move on just to satisfy the needs of our partner.
There is just one question that remains. Can authorities prove Sheree and Jalen's guilt in a court of law?
There were some serious concerns about Sheree's trial. She seemed to be the outlier because while she made a confession, she was also distancing herself from Jalen, and her depiction of their relationship together was starting to change.
Sheree Threadgill and Jalen Benton went on a 48-hour crime spree that took the life of Philip Whitaker and terrorized multiple communities in 3 different states.
Sheree's desire for affection and to please her man resulted in loss of life, damage, and fear and chaos to many citizens, all for the love of her man.
When you look at the entire sequence of events, it becomes clear, in my opinion, that they worked in tandem together. Whether it was by pulling the trigger or setting up the deal, they both worked together to leave, to get away from the situation.
As prosecutors prepare to take their case to court, officials wonder if the toxic couple will turn on one another.
Sheree had a chance to distance herself from Jalen. He was, after all, the trigger man and the one doing the robberies. But would she do it, or would she stick with the man she loves?
They were looking for her for answers as to what happened with this individual that had been shot and killed. And that's one of the reasons why they left, is because she was in fear.
But prosecutors aren't buying that Sheree feared for her life.
We know that Jalen was the one that would continuously go through the windows and, do the armed robberies. But to be the trigger man, you gotta have a driver. They had to work together to accomplish that.
You letting somebody entice you to do something that you probably didn't want to do, and at that point, you probably wanted to do it because you did it. But now look at you now. You're messed up. Your whole life is gone.
It was more of him, I believe. Like I said, love make you do crazy things.
In a last-ditch effort to avoid a criminal trial, prosecutors offer both Sheree and Jalen plea deals.
You just have to gather all the information possible. You have to make sure that all the officers involved have provided detailed reports. Make sure that the district attorney, the prosecutors are involved in every step of the way.
In the 11th hour, Sheree and Jalen both decide to take responsibility for their actions in court.
It appeared that they were going to enter a plea of guilty.
As part of their plea deal, they have to admit their guilt in the court of law. They admit to killing Philip Whitaker, they admit to shooting the woman at the Waffle House, and they admit to all of the robberies in every state.
When he was here being arraigned on the state charges, he asked if I was going to be present, and I was. I was at every hearing.
In federal court, Sheree receives 19 years in federal prison for aiding and abetting 2 business robberies and the use of firearms to facilitate the robberies. Jalen receives 30 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release for carjacking 2 business robberies and using a firearm to commit each offense.
And once they were charged, they become federal inmates. They both pled guilty in federal court and were both sentenced in federal court. So I was there for when they pled guilty and admitted to everything they did. And I was also there when they were both sentenced.
The verdict provides some comfort to Philip Whitaker's family, but it doesn't bring him back.
How can you do this? Like, why would you take this man away from his kids and his future child that was born the next day? Like, why would you take him away from his family? Like, how could you do that?
Shouldn't have took somebody's life for nothing.
What was going through your mind when you felt that you had the audacity to take someone's life?
In a shocking turn of events, officials in Columbus, Georgia decide not to press charges against Sheree and Jalen for murder. The decision hits Philip's family hard.
I honestly feel like the family would be at more peace knowing that that's what they locked up for. They locked up for something that they did in Mississippi. What about here? I was very hurt because it's like, as the family, we wanted justice, and we still want justice.
Philip's family won't stop fighting for him.
I know some family members is trying hard to get them back here, so that they can serve time for the wrongdoing that they did to our cousin.
Life is better with Sheree Threadgill and Jalen Benton off the streets.
I think I heard somebody earlier say this modern-day Bonnie and Clyde, and I don't like to say that because it makes it sound like it's some romantic adventure. And they were cold-blooded. They were cold-blooded. They'd already killed one person. There's no doubt in my mind that they would have killed others.
The memories of Philip Whitaker will last forever.
He was a family man. He was loved by all his family, of course, and of course his kids.
He was a good daddy, a great daddy.
Thrills and excitement can only take love so far before the ride eventually ends. When love causes someone to fall off the rails, there's no telling what kind of damage is done.
I never had a bad moment with him. We always shared good memories.
If you could talk to your dad right now, what would you say to him?
That I love and I miss him.
The high-altitude wind whipping down across the jagged, snow-dusted ridges of the Rocky Mountains during the winter of 1985 did not merely howl. It screamed through the pine canyons, clawing at window panes and burying the isolated valley of Boulder, Colorado, in a blinding, suffocating blanket of white silence. It was the kind of storm that cut off phone lines, paralyzed local traffic, and forced entire communities to bolt their doors, drawing inward against a bitter, sub-zero wilderness. But inside the two-story brick home tucked quietly against the timberline at 1422 Timberline Ridge, a different kind of frost had settled long before the blizzard struck, a chill born not of winter weather, but of sudden, violent, inexplicable blood. It was a Tuesday night, November 12, 1985. The neighborhood was elite, insulated by wealth, natural splendor, and a profound, unshakable sense of rural safety. People left their doors unlocked. Children walked home from school without a second thought. Locked gates were considered an urban eccentricity out of place in the majestic shadow of the Continental Divide. Until the screaming shattered the mountain air. When the Boulder County Sheriff's deputies kicked open the heavy oak front door of the Timberline residence, their flashlights cutting erratic, blinding beams through the darkened foyer, they stepped immediately into a nightmare that defied every rule of human logic. The house was dead silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the central heating unit and the faint, erratic dripping of a kitchen faucet. But the living room was a canvas of pure slaughter. Clara Vance, a 38-year-old high school literature teacher and beloved community fixture whose gentle voice and compassionate spirit had touched hundreds of local families, lay motionless on the imported Persian rug in front of the stone fireplace. She was dressed in a thick wool sweater and dark trousers, but her posture was violently twisted, pinned awkwardly against the heavy brass hearth screen. The blood, a dark, viscous pool of crimson, had soaked deep into the thick fibers of the rug, creeping outward like a living thing toward the base of the natural stone fireplace. She had not been robbed. A diamond tennis bracelet worth thousands of dollars still sparkled unmarred on her left wrist. A leather purse containing cash, credit cards, and car keys rested completely undisturbed on the entryway console table. There were no signs of a panicked ransacking, no kicked-in doors, no smashed glass, no signs of a struggle that would suggest a botched burglary or a random crime of opportunity. The home was impeccably orderly, save for the corpse lying broken in the center of the room. She had been bludgeoned. The preliminary coroner's report, filed by the county medical examiner hours later under the freezing mountain lights, revealed a devastating catalog of kinetic trauma, multiple blunt force fractures to the skull, defensive fractures across her forearms, and a final, catastrophic blow to the temple delivered with an instrument heavy, dense, and wielded with cold, calculated fury. When lead detective Harrison Vance, a seasoned investigator whose career had weathered decades of mountain homicides, stepped across the threshold, his heavy leather boots crunching slightly on the frosted entryway tiles, the air smelled sharply of cedar smoke, winter wool, and the metallic, coppery reek of fresh human mortality. Detective Vance knelt beside the slain teacher, his gloved fingers hovering just above the edge of the blood-soaked rug before he took in the chilling geometry of the room. This wasn't a break-in, Vance muttered to his partner, his flashlight beams slicing through the dark shadows of the vaulted ceiling. This wasn't a stranger crashing through a window during a snowstorm. Clara knew whoever stood in this room with her. She walked them right to this hearth, and she never saw the blow coming. Initial theories swept through the local department like wildfire through dry mountain timber. Was it a jealous colleague? A troubled student? Or a darker, more intimate secret hidden beneath the immaculate public facade of Clara's marriage to her successful husband, Arthur Vance, a prominent local real estate developer who had been away in Denver on a late-night corporate acquisition meeting when the murder occurred? Detectives tore into the couple's background, pulling phone records, interviewing neighbors, questioning colleagues, and combing through financial portfolios. They tracked Arthur Vance's movements down to the exact minute, verifying his hotel check-in in Denver, his toll road receipts, and his phone calls from the hotel lobby. Arthur had an airtight, bulletproof alibi. He had been 70 miles away when his wife's skull was crushed by an unknown assailant in their own living room. When Arthur returned home the following morning, Escorted by police officers into the cordoned-off crime scene, his reaction was a study in profound, shattering psychological shock. He collapsed onto the stairs in the entryway, his face buried in his trembling hands, sobbing so violently that the hard-boiled deputies felt a heavy knot twist in their own stomachs. He swore vengeance. He begged the police to find the monster who had torn his world apart. He offered a $50,000 reward out of his own pocket for any scrap of information leading to an arrest. And yet, as the investigation ground deeper into the freezing winter weeks, a subtle, almost imperceptible shadow began to cast itself over Arthur Vance's profound grief. Detectives noticed small inconsistencies. A discrepancy in the timeline of when Arthur claimed he last spoke to Clara on the telephone. A locked home office desk that Arthur insisted he didn't have the key to, even though locksmiths easily popped the brass cylinder to reveal a stash of private correspondence indicating severe marital strain, financial friction, and bitter arguments over a secret offshore bank account. When investigators pressed Arthur about the discrepancies, his tearful grief vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp defiance. He retained a high-powered defense attorney within 24 hours, cut off all further cooperation with the Boulder County Sheriff's Department, and refused to answer any additional questions without counsel present. The media smelled blood in the mountain air. Headlines exploded across state and national newspapers. Boulder teacher slain in Alpine Haven, the Timberline mystery, husband clams up as suspicion mounts. The tight-knit, idyllic community of Boulder fractured overnight. Neighbors looked at one another with suspicion. Dinner party conversations turned paranoid. People locked their doors for the first time in their lives. Yet, despite the mounting circumstantial smoke, investigators could never find the fire. They lacked the physical evidence to tie Arthur directly to the scene. There were no fingerprints belonging to him on the murder weapon, a heavy, brass fireplace poker that had been wiped clean of all latent prints and tossed carelessly into a snowdrift 50 yards down the Timberline Road. There was no blood on his clothes, no eyewitnesses, and no confession. As the months bled into agonizing years, the investigation lost its momentum. The mountain snows melted, summer wildflowers bloomed across the alpine meadows, and the case file was quietly bound in thick cardboard, stamped with the ominous, dreaded words, unsolved/cold case. It was moved from active homicide down into the damp, concrete vault of the Boulder County Basement Archives, a forgotten crypt where unsolved victims lay buried under layers of institutional dust. For decades, the murder of Clara Vance remained an open wound in the heart of Colorado, a chilling campfire story told in hushed tones, a local legend of a teacher killed in the snow and a husband who walked free because justice could not bridge the gap between suspicion and proof. The world kept spinning. Technology evolved at a dizzying pace. Generations of detectives came and went. Arthur Vance moved away from Boulder, remarried, built a massive real estate empire across the Southwest, and lived out his life in wealthy, unblemished luxury under the warm desert sun of Scottsdale, Arizona. Until, nearly 4 decades later, the wheel of karma finally turned full circle in a quiet hospice room in the scorching summer of 2026. The sterile, fluorescent light of the Desert Vista Hospice facility in Scottsdale, Arizona, hummed with a quiet, unrelenting clinical persistence on a scorching July afternoon in 2026. Outside, the desert heat shimmered off the asphalt parking lots in blinding, wavy ribbons, pushing temperatures well past the triple-digit mark. Inside room 214, the air was artificially chilled, smelling faintly of antiseptic wipes, dried lavender, and the unmistakable, hollow metallic scent of a human life slowly draining down to its final, fragile embers. Lying propped up on a motorized hospital bed, tethered to a clear plastic nasal cannula that hissed rhythmically with oxygen, was Arthur Vance. At 82 years old, the once formidable real estate titan looked like a shadow carved from old parchment. His skin was translucent, stretched tightly across hollow cheekbones and skeletal hands that lay resting limply on top of a thin white cotton sheet. The sharp, piercing intellect that had allowed him to build a multi-million-dollar empire and outwit the entire Boulder County Sheriff's Department back in the winter of 1985 had been eroded by advanced terminal lung cancer and the merciless march of time. His chest rose and fell in shallow, jagged gasps, every breath a labored battle against a body that was shutting down organ by organ. Beside the bed sat a solitary figure, Detective Marcus Vance, no relation to Arthur, despite the haunting coincidence of the name, now retired from the Boulder County Cold Case Unit, having spent the final 15 years of his career chasing the ghost of Clara Vance's unsolved murder. Marcus had flown down from Colorado 48 hours earlier after receiving an encrypted, urgent voicemail left on his personal cell phone by the hospice's palliative care nurse. The message had been brief, delivered in a trembling, hesitant whisper. Arthur Vance is fading fast. He's been raving in his sleep, calling out for Clara, begging for a priest, and telling anyone who will listen that he has a confession to make before his lungs give out. Marcus stepped closer to the edge of the bed, his boots making no sound on the polished linoleum floor. He wore a simple dark suit, his silver hair cropped short, his eyes lined with the profound, hard-earned exhaustion of a cop who had spent a lifetime staring into the abyss of human cruelty. Arthur's cloudy, faded blue eyes fluttered open. He turned his head sluggishly across the stiff hospital pillow, his gaze locking onto Marcus with a sudden, startling flicker of lucidity. The dying man's dry, cracked lips parted, attempting to speak, but only a dry, rattling cough emerged from his throat. Marcus reached out, pouring a small paper cup of ice water from the bedside pitcher, dipping a sterile foam swab into the liquid, and gently moistening Arthur's parched lips. "Take it easy, Arthur," Marcus said softly, his voice low, steady, and devoid of judgment. "You don't have to rush. I'm here." Arthur swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply beneath his wrinkled neck. He reached out with a trembling, paper-thin hand, his claw-like fingers grasping desperately at the sleeve of Marcus's suit jacket, pulling the detective closer down toward the bed. "The snow," Arthur whispered, his voice a dry, rasping hiss that barely rose above the hum of the oxygen machine. "It never really melted, Marcus. Not for me. For 41 years, every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear her boots crunching on the frozen deck outside. I could still see her standing by that damn fireplace." Marcus pulled up a metal folding chair, sitting directly beside the bed, resting his elbows on his knees as he leaned in close. "You've carried it a long time, Arthur. Why now? Why call me down here after all these decades of silence?" Arthur let out a weak, humorless chuckle that quickly dissolved into a painful coughing fit. His chest heaved violently before he managed to drag a deep, whistling breath into his lungs. "Because hell is real, Detective," Arthur wheezed, his eyes widening with a sudden, manic terror that made the hairs on the back of Marcus's neck stand up. "And it isn't fire and brimstone. It's memory. It's sitting in a room like this, waiting for the dark to take you, knowing that you sold your soul for a pile of dirt and a bank account that I couldn't take with me. I beat your badge, Marcus. I outsmarted your entire department back in '85, but I couldn't outrun myself." The silence in the room grew heavy, oppressive, charged with the electric weight of a decades-old secret finally dragging itself up out of the grave. Marcus pulled a digital voice recorder from his coat pocket, clicked the record button with a soft, mechanical click, and laid it quietly on the bedside table. "Tell me everything, Arthur," Marcus instructed, his tone firm, steady, and unyielding. "Tell me what happened inside that house on Timberline Ridge on November 12th, 1985. Arthur closed his eyes for a long moment, his chest rising and falling as his mind drifted back across the chasm of 41 years, peeling away the layers of wealth, success, and carefully constructed lies to reveal the rotten, blood-soaked core of his past. "Clara was too smart for her own good," Arthur began, his voice dropping to a fragile, hypnotic whisper that seemed to echo off the stark white walls of the hospice room. "That was her fatal flaw. People thought she was just a sweet, soft-spoken high school literature teacher, but she saw through every mask I wore. By the fall of 1985, She had discovered what I was really doing behind the corporate curtain. The embezzlement, the fraudulent land titles, the offshore shell corporations I was using to siphon funds from our real estate partnership to finance my gambling debts and my double life in Denver. Arthur paused, licking his dry lips, his breathing growing more shallow and erratic. She didn't threaten to go to the police right away, Arthur continued, a bitter grimace twisting his pale face. That would have been messy. No, Clara was more clinical than that. She sat me down at the kitchen table 3 days before the murder, slid divorce papers across the wood, and told me she was taking everything, the house, the bank accounts, the investments, everything I had spent my entire life building. She said she was going to expose my entire financial syndicate to the federal authorities and ruin me publicly, completely, and permanently. So you decided to murder her, Marcus stated flatly, not asking a question, simply recording the grim arithmetic of motive. It wasn't personal, Arthur whispered, a chilling, psychopathic detachment slipping momentarily through his cracked facade. It was business. In my world, you don't let a liability destroy your entire existence. I engineered my alibi weeks in advance. I set up meetings in Denver, left my company car parked in a hotel garage downtown, caught a late afternoon commuter bus back up into the mountains under a fake name, and walked through the backwoods to our house while the blizzard was just beginning to blow. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, his hands curling into tight fists inside his pockets. She let you in, didn't she? Because she thought you were in Denver. She was sitting by the fireplace, grading student essays, Arthur murmured, a distant, haunted look in his fading eyes. She didn't even hear me come through the back mudroom. I picked up the heavy brass fireplace poker from the hearth. She turned around just as I swung. She looked at me, Marcus. She didn't scream. She just looked at me with this profound, crushing disappointment in her eyes that hurt worse than any prison sentence ever could. Arthur let out a long, shuddering sigh, his fingers slowly slipping off Marcus's sleeve and falling limp onto the white bedsheet. His breathing began to hitch, the interval between his gasps growing dangerously long and ragged. I wiped the poker clean, Arthur whispered, his voice fading rapidly into a breathless rattle. Threw it in the snow down the road. Drove back to Denver through the storm. Established my return alibi. And watched the police chase their own tails for 40 years. He stopped. His chest hitched one final time, a shallow tremor rippling through his frail frame. His eyes rolled upward toward the ceiling, fixed on something invisible, something waiting just beyond the threshold of the sterile hospital room. The heart monitor by the bed let out a long, unbroken, high-pitched electronic shriek. The green digital line on the screen flattened into a cold, motionless horizontal straight line. Arthur Vance was dead. The master architect of the 1985 Timberline murder had taken his final secret to the grave, leaving behind a digital audio recording that would instantly shatter the peace of Boulder, Colorado, and reopen a cold case that the world had long since given up for dead. The digital audio file recorded inside room 214 of the Desert Vista Hospice facility didn't just cross state lines. It hit the Boulder County Sheriff's Department like a localized shockwave, detonating a decades-old crater of institutional frustration and public fury. Within 24 hours of Arthur Vance's deathbed confession, the digital recording had been extracted, decrypted, authenticated by federal forensic audio engineers, and played before an emergency closed-door session of the county grand jury. The reaction was immediate, visceral, and irreversible. The cold case box labeled Vance, Clara, Homicide 1985, which had gathered undisturbed layers of fine, gray dust in the damp concrete basement vault of the courthouse for over 40 years, was yanked from its metal shelving. The rusted brass latches popped open with a sharp, echoing snap, exposing yellowed Polaroids of a blood-stained Persian rug, brittle typewritten interview transcripts from trembling neighbors, and evidence bags containing fibers that had long since lost their forensic secrets. Except now, those secrets didn't matter. The confession had changed everything. Lead Detective Marcus Vance, now officially retired, yet tethered to this case by an unbreakable, lifelong thread of professional obsession, sat at his old oak desk in the precinct, staring down at the forensic blueprint of the 1985 crime scene. Next to him lay the printed transcript of Arthur's final, rattling breaths in the Arizona hospice room. "He played us all," Marcus muttered to himself, running a calloused hand across his tired eyes as the harsh overhead fluorescent light beat down on his silver hair. 41 years. He sat in country clubs, built multi-million-dollar developments, remarried, vacationed in Europe, and slept like a baby while Clara lay cold in a local cemetery. And he would have gotten away with it if cancer hadn't caught up to his lungs. The media storm that followed the leak of the confession was apocalyptic. Local and national news networks descended upon Boulder like a flock of predatory birds. Satellite broadcast vans choked the narrow mountain roads around the old Timberline Ridge property. Reporters thrust microphones at current and former law enforcement officials, demanding to know how a killer had slipped through their fingers in the winter of 1985. Talk radio programs buzzed with angry callers. Internet true crime forums exploded into viral threads dissecting every minute detail of Arthur's elaborate alibi, and the public conscience of Colorado was violently ripped open once again. For the community of Boulder, the revelation was nothing short of a collective trauma reopening. People who had known Clara as a gentle, soft-spoken educator remembered the exact day in November 1985 when the news of her murder had frozen the town in terror. They remembered the whispered rumors, the suspicious husband who clammed up behind a wall of expensive defense attorneys, and the bitter, lingering disappointment when the investigation ground to a bureaucratic halt. Now the truth was out. But truth without a living defendant to put in handcuffs felt hollow, an incomplete equation that left a bitter taste in the mouth of justice. Arthur Vance could no longer be tried in a court of law. He couldn't stand before a jury of his peers, couldn't hear a judge bang a wooden gavel to sentence him to a concrete box, and couldn't experience the stripping away of his freedom the way Clara had experienced the stripping away of her life on that blood-soaked Persian rug. Death had cheated the gallows. Cancer had robbed the courtroom of its final verdict. Yet, Marcus Vance knew that an investigation doesn't truly end just because the perpetrator's heart stops beating. There were loose ends, fragments of Arthur's corporate empire, hidden accounts, offshore assets, and co-conspirators who might have known about the financial crimes that served as the primary catalyst for murder. If Arthur had been laundering funds through complex real estate shell corporations back in the 80s to cover his tracks, someone else had to have helped him move the money. Someone else had signed the papers, notarized the fraudulent deeds, or looked the other way while a human life was treated as a disposable line item on a balance sheet. Marcus leaned forward, pulling a secondary file from the archive box, a collection of corporate financial records subpoenaed back in 1986, but never fully audited due to a lack of manpower and the ironclad privacy walls erected by Arthur's defense team. He flipped open the faded manila folder, his eyes scanning the neat, ledger-lined columns of numbers, wire transfers, and corporate entity names dating back to the months leading up to Clara's murder. Most of the names were long dissolved, phantom companies registered in the Cayman Islands, dummy corporations in Nevada, and local holding companies in Denver that had vanished into thin air decades ago. But one name caught Marcus's eye. A subsidiary real estate firm called Alpine Ridge Holdings LLC, registered in November 1985, just 3 weeks before Clara was bludgeoned to death in her living room. And listed as the primary managing director, holding 30% equity in the shadow company, was not Arthur Vance. It was a man named Julian Vance Holloway. Marcus froze, the blood draining instantly from his face as a cold, terrifying prickle of realization raced down his spine. The name, Vance Holloway, was not a local name. It wasn't a Boulder native. It was a name that Marcus had encountered only months earlier while reviewing federal archival files relating to multi-state identity laundering syndicates operating across the Pacific Northwest during the exact same era. Julian Vance Holloway, the man who would later become infamous across federal intelligence circles as the Maritime Phantom, a calculating, highly educated corporate predator and fugitive who utilized stolen identities, false military-grade maritime rigging, and subterranean vaults to conceal his crimes before eventually ending his days locked away inside the absolute, soundproof solitary confinement of ADX Florence. Marcus stared at the document, his breath catching in his throat. The coincidence was statistically impossible. Arthur Vance, a prominent Colorado real estate developer, hadn't just been committing run-of-the-mill financial fraud to fund gambling debts. He had been tied directly into an interstate, high-stakes syndicate operating across state lines, a syndicate whose structural architect was none other than Julian Vance Holloway. The murder of Clara Vance wasn't just a domestic homicide born of a messy divorce and threatened exposure over local embezzlement. It was an execution demanded by a much larger, darker, and infinitely more dangerous criminal network that could not afford to have its financial conduits exposed by a sharp-witted high school literature teacher who refused to look the other way. Marcus stood up abruptly from his desk, knocking his coffee mug over in a clatter of dark liquid that seeped across the desktop, ignoring the mess entirely as he grabbed his telephone receiver. The Colorado cold case wasn't just solved. It had just blown wide open into a federal conspiracy that stretched from the snowy peaks of the Rocky Mountains all the way down to the dark, chilling waters of the Pacific Northwest. The realization that Arthur Vance's financial corruption was tied directly to the sprawling, dark infrastructure of Julian Vance Holloway transformed the Boulder County Sheriff's Department from a local investigative unit into the front line of an expanding federal inquiry. The single sheet of paper bearing Julian's name within the 1985 corporate filings of Alpine Ridge Holdings was no longer a mere artifact of a forgotten real estate partnership. It was a smoking gun connecting a quiet mountain murder to an interstate syndicate of identity laundering and calculated corporate predation. Lead Detective Marcus Vance wasted no time. Within hours of discovering the cross-jurisdictional link, he placed an encrypted, high-priority call to Special Agent Thomas Vance at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's field office in Seattle, the very investigator who had spent years tracking the digital and physical ghost trails of the maritime phantom. "Thomas, it's Marcus," Vance said, his voice taut with an urgent, adrenaline-fueled intensity as he paced the length of his cluttered precinct office. "We just finished auditing Arthur Vance's pre-murder corporate ledgers from the winter of '85. You're not going to believe who is sitting on the board of his primary shadow holding company." On the other end of the line, in a brightly lit federal bullpen surrounded by towering stacks of maritime shipping logs and financial audit trails, Agent Thomas Vance leaned back in his chair, his expression instantly sharpening. "Don't tell me." "Alpine Ridge Holdings," Marcus confirmed, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the telephone receiver. "Registered 3 weeks before Clara Vance was beaten to death in her own living room. And holding 30% equity, pulling the financial strings behind Arthur's local embezzlement, was Julian Vance Holloway." A profound, heavy silence hung over the phone line for several seconds. Agent Thomas Vance exhaled slowly, the gravity of the connection settling like lead in his chest. "It all fits," Thomas murmured, half to himself. In the mid-'80s, right when Julian was establishing his coastal shipping fronts in Oregon and Washington, he was also expanding his capital footprint inland. He needed clean, domestic real estate fronts to launder the proceeds of his maritime acquisitions. Arthur Vance wasn't just a crooked developer with a gambling problem, Marcus. He was a regional asset for Julian's network. And Clara found out, Marcus added, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with terrifying clarity. She didn't just stumble onto local embezzlement. She found documents bearing Julian's name, or references to an offshore network that she threatened to hand straight to federal prosecutors. Arthur couldn't silence that kind of exposure on his own. He needed help, or, at the very least, he had the green light from the top of the food chain to eliminate the liability. The investigation shifted instantly from a local cold case review into a massive, multi-agency federal coordination effort. Federal investigators, forensic accountants, and cyber sleuths descended upon archived corporate registries, microfiche vaults, and regional bank records spanning 3 decades. They discovered that while Julian Vance Holloway was orchestrating his sophisticated operations along the Pacific coast, he maintained a web of silent, dormant financial conduits across the Rocky Mountain corridor, conduits managed in large part by regional partners like Arthur Vance. As the federal net widened, teams of forensic investigators combed through the historical property transactions associated with Alpine Ridge Holdings. They pulled old county deeds, architectural blueprints, and land surveys from 1985 through 1990, searching for hidden assets or secondary properties that might mirror the subterranean vaults discovered months prior in Rabun County, Georgia, and along the rugged Oregon coastline. The investigation led them deep into the Roosevelt National Forest, just 20 miles outside of Boulder, where Arthur Vance had once owned an expansive, secluded tract of timberland known locally as Whispering Pine Ridge. By August of 2026, federal excavation crews equipped with ground-penetrating radar, heavy industrial backhoes, and portable sonar imaging units had surrounded the remote forest acreage. The dense canopy of pine and aspen trees cast dappled shadows across the red dirt as heavy machinery tore into the rugged terrain, searching for anomalies beneath the forest floor. Special Agent Thomas Vance stood beside Marcus Vance near the edge of the excavation zone, watching as a team of federal technicians marked off grid coordinates with bright orange stakes and yellow police tape. If Julian used this region the way he used the Southeast and the Pacific Northwest, there has to be a secondary repository here, Thomas said, shielding his eyes from the glaring summer sun as he consulted a digital survey tablet. Arthur's financial ledgers show massive, unexplained cash withdrawals routed through Alpine Ridge Holdings during the exact quarter Clara was murdered. That money didn't go to bank accounts or real estate investments. It went into construction. Marcus looked out across the sprawling, silent expanse of the forest, his face etched with a grim, unyielding determination. A man like Julian doesn't leave loose ends, Thomas. If he helped Arthur orchestrate the cover-up of Clara's murder, or if this forest holds the physical evidence of other victims who vanished from the mountain towns during the mid-'80s, we are going to find it, no matter how deep they buried it. The backhoes roared to life, their heavy steel buckets biting deep into the dark mountain soil, turning up roots, rock, and history as the search for the mountain phantom's hidden Colorado legacy officially began. The heavy roar of the industrial backhoe engines cut sharply through the pristine mountain silence of the Roosevelt National Forest, vibrating deep within the chests of the federal agents and forensic specialists who had cordoned off the Whispering Pine Ridge acreage. High above the rugged tree line, the midday summer sun beat down relentlessly, baking the dark, damp mountain soil and filling the crisp alpine air with the sharp, resinous scent of crushed pine needles, disturbed clay, and ancient, rotting timber. Special Agent Thomas Vance stood at the edge of the newly established excavation grid, his eyes fixed on the massive mechanical steel bucket as it scooped away another massive layer of earth from Sector 4. Beside him, retired Detective Marcus Vance watched with a quiet, unblinking intensity, his hand resting instinctively on the brim of his weathered leather jacket. For 3 days, the excavation teams had combed through the dense forest floor, guided by historical ground-penetrating radar anomalies and the decoded financial ledgers recovered from Arthur Vance's Shell Corporation archives. They had uncovered old logging trails, rusted remnants of mid-'80s construction equipment, and forgotten concrete footings that confirmed industrial activity had taken place deep within this isolated timber tract right around the time Clara Vance was murdered in Boulder. Then, the backhoe operator raised his hand, signaling a sudden, immediate halt. The deep-throated rumble of the diesel engine died down to a low, rattling idle. The forest fell into an eerie, instantaneous stillness, broken only by the whistling of the wind through the high mountain canopy and the nervous chirping of displaced birds darting among the branches. "Sir, you need to see this," called out the lead site technician, his voice echoing slightly as he scrambled down the muddy embankment into the freshly excavated trench. He was waving frantically toward Thomas and Marcus, holding a high-powered tactical flashlight in one hand and a stiff metal brush in the other. Thomas and Marcus did not hesitate. They scrambled down the steep, unstable slope of red clay, their boots sliding slightly in the loose dirt before they reached the bottom of the trench and stepped up beside the technician. At the base of the trench, protruding half an inch from a vertical wall of compacted gray clay and shattered rock, was a dull, industrial-grade sheet of reinforced steel. It was bolted flush against a massive, poured concrete bulkhead that extended deep into the subterranean bedrock of the mountain ridge. Marcus knelt down, pulling a pair of sterile work gloves over his hands. He reached out, brushing away a thick cake of wet red earth from the face of the metal plate to reveal a series of stamped serial numbers and a heavy, multi-pin mechanical locking mechanism, the unmistakable hallmark of commercial marine-grade vault construction. "Look at the engineering," Marcus muttered, his breath catching in his throat as his gloved fingers traced the cold, damp steel rivets. "This isn't a septic tank. It isn't a root cellar. This is a secure, waterproof holding chamber built to withstand hydrostatic pressure, exactly like the vaults in Rabun County. And look at the ceiling gaskets," Thomas added, shining his tactical flashlight along the perimeter of the steel door where a thick strip of black vulcanized rubber ran around the frame. "Neoprene-backed industrial sealing.
Airtight.
Watertight. Designed to preserve whatever was placed inside indefinitely, protecting it from moisture, decay, and the natural elements." The discovery of the subterranean bulkhead transformed the mood of the entire excavation site from one of tense anticipation to grim, clinical urgency. Word spread rapidly among the federal teams. Specialized forensic structural engineers, hazardous materials technicians, and state crime scene investigators were immediately brought down into the trench, stringing high-intensity portable work lights along the muddy walls and setting up a temporary triage station just outside the hidden entrance. For the next 4 hours, the team worked with painstaking, millimeter-precision care. They scraped away the remaining overburden of earth, exposed the entire perimeter of the heavy steel door, and inspected the locking mechanism for any potential chemical or explosive hazards. By late afternoon, the architectural diagrams recovered from Arthur Vance's former estate archives were cross-referenced with the physical layout of the subterranean bunker. According to the blueprint schematics, this specific underground chamber, designated internally as Sector Alpha Mountain, had been constructed in November of 1985, funded entirely through anonymous wire transfers routed via Alpine Ridge Holdings just days before Clara Vance was beaten to death in her Boulder living room. "He didn't just help Arthur cover up a murder," Marcus said quietly, standing just feet away from the heavy steel door as technicians prepared to breach the locking mechanism with a hydraulic extraction wedge. Julian Vance Holloway used Arthur's local real estate influence to secure a private, high-security archival vault right here in Colorado, a secret secondary repository where he could store the physical evidence of his operations, or perhaps people who crossed his path. "We're about to find out," Thomas replied, stepping back and donning his N95 respirator mask alongside the forensic specialists. "Breach team, go ahead." The hydraulic wedge was positioned with meticulous care against the reinforced steel door. The operator pumped the manual lever, and with a loud, metallic shriek that echoed hollowly through the underground shaft, the heavy locking pins disengaged from the concrete frame. A sudden hiss of stale, highly pressurized air escaped from the seal, a cold, subterranean breath that smelled faintly of stagnant mineral water, ancient concrete, and the unmistakable, hollow void of a space that had remained completely undisturbed for over 40 years. The technicians waited several minutes for the internal air to cycle through portable ventilation hoses before stepping forward to swing the heavy steel door wide open. High-powered LED floodlights were mounted on adjustable tripods and thrust directly into the dark, cavernous opening of the subterranean vault. Thomas, Marcus, and the lead forensic anthropologist stepped cautiously across the threshold, their boots clicking sharply against a smooth, poured concrete floor. The interior of the vault was a chilling testament to methodical, cold-blooded organization. Unlike the chaotic crime scenes usually encountered in homicide investigations, this underground chamber was pristine, clinical, and eerily sterile. The walls were lined with custom aluminum shelving units, bolted securely into the concrete. Hanging neatly from stainless steel hooks along the back wall were various lengths of heavy-duty maritime rigging, marine-grade cable clamps, and specialized nylon cordage, the exact signature tying the location directly to the maritime syndicate masterminded by Julian Vance Holloway. In the center of the room sat a massive, heavy-duty oak drafting table, covered in a thin, undisturbed layer of fine white mineral dust. Resting atop the center of the desk was a brass desk lamp, an unopened box of vintage matches from a Denver hotel, and a thick, leather-bound operational ledger identical in every way to the journals recovered from the Rabun County Quarry and the Oregon coastal estates. Marcus walked slowly past the metal shelving units, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating rows of numbered plastic storage bins, sealed evidence containers, and archival folders neatly labeled with precise dates and alphanumeric codes. "Look at the labeling," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he stopped in front of a shelf containing a series of mid-80s case files. "These aren't just corporate ledgers. These are personal files. Missing persons reports, university enrollment records, driver's licenses, and photographs of young women and men who vanished across Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah between 1982 and 1988. Thomas stepped up beside him, opening a transparent archival sleeve resting on the drafting table. Inside was a handwritten note penned in the familiar, precise, left-leaning cursive script of Julian Vance Holloway. The text was brief, chillingly clinical, and devoid of any human emotion. November 1985. Boulder asset successfully secured. Local interference permanently neutralized. Archival preservation initiated to guarantee absolute operational continuity across the Continental Corridor. The note was a direct, undeniable confession written in Julian's own hand, linking the syndicate's inner workings directly to the murder of Clara Vance and the construction of the Mountain Vault. Arthur Vance hadn't just been an unprincipled business partner. He had been a subordinate operative caught in the machinery of a much larger, darker empire. Up above, on the surface of the ridge, the sun began its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, casting long, dramatic shadows across the forest floor. The excavation site hummed with quiet, tense activity as forensic teams began bagging and tagging the historical evidence, transporting decades of buried secrets out of the dark and back into the light of day. The Mountain Phantom's Colorado legacy had finally been laid bare. And the absolute truth of what happened in the winter of 1985 was no longer hidden beneath the snow. The discovery of the subterranean vault within the Roosevelt National Forest transformed the entire investigation from a localized cold case review into a massive, nationwide federal inquiry that dominated front-page headlines and primetime news broadcasts across the United States. In the crisp, high-altitude air of late August 2026, the temporary federal command post established outside Boulder looked more like a military encampment than a law enforcement staging area. Satellite trucks, forensic science vans, and mobile DNA profiling laboratories formed a dense ring around the perimeter of the sealed forest excavation site, casting a web of bright white floodlights across the pine needles as night fell over the Continental Divide. Inside the primary forensic tent, Special Agent Thomas Vance and retired Detective Marcus Vance stood over a sprawling, stainless steel examination table covered in the artifacts recovered from the underground vault. The air inside the tent was thick with the scent of ozone from portable generators, industrial hand sanitizer, and the sharp, chemical tang of preserved archival paper. Sprawled across the table were dozens of plastic evidence bags containing personal items, driver's licenses, university ID cards, jewelry, and handwritten notebooks recovered from the locked filing cabinets inside the subterranean bunker. Each item represented a ghost, a young man or woman who had vanished without a trace from college towns, ski resorts, and remote highway truck stops across Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah during the turbulent mid-80s. "The scale of this operation is staggering," Thomas said, his voice heavy with exhaustion as he lifted a faded University of Colorado student ID card bearing a photograph of a smiling 19-year-old woman who had disappeared while hitchhiking through the Rockies in the fall of 1984. Arthur Vance wasn't just hiding financial embezzlement for Julian Vance Holloway. He was providing local logistical cover for a regional collection hub. Every single one of these folders corresponds to an unsolved missing persons case from this exact geographic corridor. Marcus stared down at the ID card, his face carved into hard, grim lines. The flickering overhead fluorescent light cast deep shadows beneath his eyes. For decades, he had lived with the gnawing frustration of the Clara Vance murder, believing it was an isolated domestic tragedy born of marital betrayal and financial desperation. Now, Looking at the sprawling network of evidence laid out before him, he realized that Clara's death had not been an anomaly. It had been an execution driven by self-preservation, designed to protect an industrial-scale criminal enterprise that stretched from the Pacific coastline all the way to the foot of the Rocky Mountains. Clara didn't just stumble onto Arthur's offshore bank accounts, Marcus said quietly, his gaze locked onto a handwritten inventory sheet signed with Julian's precise, left-leaning cursive script. She found the ledger. She found the cross-references linking her husband's real estate front company to Julian's maritime logistics network and these missing persons files. She knew too much, and she threatened to expose the entire apparatus to the federal authorities. Arthur couldn't handle that kind of exposure on his own, so he went to the architect. And the architect gave the order. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Department of Justice. Although Julian Vance Holloway was already locked away inside the absolute, soundproof solitary confinement of ADX Florence in Colorado, serving multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, the new evidence from Sector Alpha Mountain meant that federal prosecutors could formally indict him on additional counts of conspiracy, kidnapping, and first-degree murder related to the Colorado cold cases. While federal attorneys prepared the expanded indictments, the forensic anthropology teams continued their methodical work inside the subterranean vault in the Roosevelt National Forest. Beneath the primary chamber, operating with ground-penetrating sonar and high-resolution acoustic imaging, they discovered a secondary, heavily reinforced concrete seal sunk deep into the bedrock beneath the floorboards. The second seal required specialized thermal cutting torches and hydraulic rams to breach. For over 6 hours, sparks flew in a brilliant, blinding cascade within the underground shaft as technicians sliced through 3 inches of tempered manganese steel. When the final seal finally gave way, a dense cloud of cold, ancient air rushed upward, carrying the unmistakable scent of undisturbed earth and historical preservation. Descending into the lower chamber with tactical flashlights and respiratory masks, the recovery team entered a series of individual, climate-controlled preservation cells engineered with the exact same industrial specifications as the notorious vaults discovered earlier in Rabun County, Georgia, and the Oregon coastal estate. There, resting on stainless steel racks inside sealed nitrogen-flush display units, were the preserved personal belongings and remains of multiple victims who had vanished during the height of the syndicate's operational peak in the mid-1980s. The meticulous, psychopathic attention to detail was chilling. Every artifact had been cleaned, cataloged, and indexed according to an internal taxonomic system designed by a man who viewed human life as raw material to be curated, classified, and filed away into the dark. Word of the subterranean discoveries swept rapidly across the nation, triggering an unprecedented wave of public response. Families who had spent 40 years searching in vain for missing children, siblings, and spouses flooded federal tip lines and media outlets with inquiries. The digital documentary series The Maritime Phantom, which had already broken global streaming records, released a special emergency update detailing the Colorado excavations, pushing public awareness to a fever pitch. In San Francisco, inside her soundproof studio booth, Sarah Lynn stared at her workstation monitor as global download statistics shattered previous milestones. The podcast had transcended true crime entertainment. It had become a living, breathing instrument of historical reckoning. Yet, as she read through the endless stream of messages pouring into her digital portal from families across the Rocky Mountain region, she felt a profound, sobering weight. "We're not just uncovering cold cases," Sarah spoke into her studio microphone, recording a supplementary audio briefing for the archival records. "We are unraveling a systemic architecture of silence that protected institutional predators for decades. Every file recovered from that mountain vault represents a human life stolen by a man who believed his intellect and his wealth made him entirely untouchable by the laws of man." Back in Boulder, the autumn air was turning crisp and amber leaves began to drift across the sidewalks as the community confronted its darkest history. Memorial foundations were established in honor of Clara Vance and the newly identified victims of the Mountain Vault, transforming public grief into a permanent force for institutional transparency and investigative reform. Marcus Vance stood on the windswept porch of his home on a quiet evening, looking out toward the majestic, snow-capped peaks of the Continental Divide. The investigation that had consumed his entire professional life was finally reaching its ultimate, definitive conclusion. The Mountain Phantom's final stronghold had been breached, his secrets exposed to the unmerciful light of day, and the victims pulled from the dark silence of the earth. The shadow that had hung over the Rockies for 41 years was finally lifting, and the mountain stood tall, clear, and unyielding against the fading light of the evening sky. The early September frost of 2026 came early to the high-altitude passes of the Rocky Mountains, painting the jagged peaks of the Continental Divide with a brilliant, blinding layer of white against an intensely cobalt sky. Down in Boulder, the frenzy of the federal excavation site had settled into a steady, methodical rhythm of post-recovery analysis. The subterranean vaults discovered deep within the Roosevelt National Forest had been entirely cataloged, their contents safely transported under heavily armed federal convoy to the secure forensic repositories in Denver, and the physical crime scene secured with tamper-evident federal seals. Inside the stark, windowless conference room of the FBI's Denver field office, Special Agent Thomas Vance stood before a massive magnetic whiteboard that spanned the entire length of the wall. The board was a complex, sprawling mosaic of red yarn, historical black and white photographs, financial ledgers, corporate flowcharts, and certified architectural blueprints. At the very center of the web sat two primary nodes, one labeled Julian Vance Holloway, ADX Florence, and the other labeled Alpine Ridge Holdings / Arthur Vance, deceased. Seated around the mahogany conference table were senior federal prosecutors, state investigators, regional forensic specialists, and retired Detective Marcus Vance, whose weathered hands rested flat against the polished wood surface. "We have reached the absolute structural boundary of the conspiracy," Thomas announced, his voice steady and formal as he tapped a dry erase marker against the whiteboard. The expanded federal indictments against Julian Vance Holloway for the 1985 abduction and conspiracy to commit the murder of Clara Vance, along with 4 additional homicides linked to the Sector Alpha Mountain Vault, have been officially filed with the United States District Court for the District of Colorado. Because Julian is already serving multiple consecutive life sentences without parole at ADX Florence, these new charges will ensure that his legal isolation is total, permanent, and impervious to any future appellate loopholes. A murmur of quiet professional satisfaction rippled through the room. For the prosecutors and investigators who had spent decades chasing the ghosts of the Maritime Syndicate, this moment represented the final, untouchable brick in the prison wall surrounding a monster. Yet, as the legal machinery locked into place, the human element of the tragedy remained painfully, acutely raw. Marcus Vance leaned back in his chair, staring at a photograph pinned to the far left corner of the whiteboard, a portrait of Clara Vance taken in her high school classroom back in the autumn of 1985, her smile warm, intelligent, and entirely untouched by the terrifying reality that awaited her. "Legal closure is necessary, Thomas," Marcus spoke up, his raspy voice cutting through the quiet murmurs of the room. "It puts a stamp on the paperwork, updates the national databases, and satisfies the requirements of a federal court. But paperwork doesn't heal 40 years of silence for the families who spent every holiday wondering why their daughter, sister, or mother simply vanished off the face of the earth." "No, it doesn't," Thomas agreed, turning to face Marcus with a sympathetic, solemn nod. "That's why the Department of Justice, in coordination with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the independent archival network established by Sarah Lynn's podcast, is launching the formal restitution and memorial initiative next week. Every single artifact, personal item, and recovered family heirloom cataloged from the mountain vaults is being returned to surviving relatives. We are making sure that history remembers them not as anonymous victims of a syndicate, but as real people with real lives, real dreams, and families who never stopped loving them." The initiative was more than a symbolic gesture. It was a massive, coordinated national effort to dismantle the legacy of anonymity that Julian Vance Holloway had spent a lifetime constructing. For decades, the syndicate relied on the assumption that if you erased a person's digital and physical trail, replaced their identity with a forged birth certificate, and buried their remains in a reinforced concrete vault, the world would eventually forget they ever existed. The public response across the country proved just how profoundly that calculation had failed. Thousands of miles away in San Francisco, Sarah Lynn sat in her soundproof studio booth, reviewing the preliminary transcripts of the upcoming bonus archival release for the Maritime Phantom. Her workstation screen displayed a digital monument of grief and resilience, tens of thousands of messages from listeners, historians, and educators who had organized community memorials, scholarship funds in Clara Vance's name, and university lectures addressing the systemic vulnerabilities exploited by identity laundering predators. Sarah knew that her role as the investigative storyteller of this sprawling saga was drawing to its natural close. The digital series had achieved what traditional journalism rarely managed. It had forced institutional systems to evolve, catalyzed federal cold case task forces, and restored dignity to the forgotten dead. She leaned into her studio microphone, her voice capturing the quiet, contemplative gravity of the moment for the final historical record. When we began this investigation, Sarah spoke softly into the high-end condenser mic, the audio rendering with pristine, broadcast-quality clarity. We were chasing the myth of the Maritime Phantom, a ghost story born of coastal fogs, hidden shipwrecks, and corporate shadows. But as we dug deeper, peeling back the layers of wealth, academic pretense, and institutional silence, we learned a sobering truth. Monsters do not hide in fairy tales. They sit at our dinner tables, manage our financial ledgers, and walk down our sunlit streets wearing the masks of respectable citizens. They believe that time and distance are their greatest allies. But they underestimate the human capacity for memory. They underestimate the detective who refuses to let a case gather dust in a basement. And above all, they underestimate the enduring power of truth to tear down even the strongest concrete vault. She hit save on the master audio file, locking the session permanently into the global archives. Back in Boulder, the afternoon sunlight cast long, golden rays across the sprawling campus, where Clara Vance had once taught literature to generations of eager students. A brand new bronze plaque, embedded in a polished block of Colorado granite beneath the shade of a towering oak tree, had been unveiled earlier that morning in a quiet, deeply moving ceremony attended by hundreds of local residents, current faculty members, and surviving family members. The inscription on the plaque was simple, elegant, and permanent. In memory of Clara Vance, 1947 to 1985. Educator, scholar, and guardian of truth. The truth cannot be buried forever. The light will always find its way home. Retired Detective Marcus Vance stood alone by the granite memorial long after the crowd had dispersed, the autumn wind rustling the dry oak leaves overhead. He pulled his weathered leather notebook from his coat pocket, flipping slowly through pages filled with decades-old scribbles, suspect timelines, phone numbers of long-retired informants, and frantic marginal notes scrawled under the harsh glare of precinct desk lamps. He turned to the final, blank page at the very back of the book. With a steady, deliberate hand, using a black ink pen that had served him through years of frustration and relentless pursuit, Marcus wrote a single word across the empty paper. Resolved. He snapped the leather cover shut with a satisfying, muffled click. He slipped the notebook back into his coat pocket, turned his back to the memorial stone, and walked slowly down the sidewalk toward the sunlit streets of Boulder. The multi-decade nightmare that had begun on a freezing November night in 1985 was officially over. The Mountain Phantom was sealed in an inescapable concrete tomb in the desert. The hidden vaults had been dragged out of the dark. And for the first time in over 40 years, the Rocky Mountains stood tall, clear, and entirely at peace under the open sky. The autumn of 2026 brought a strange, unprecedented stillness to the high-altitude landscapes of the American West. In the shadow of the Continental Divide, the frenzy of media vans, federal excavation teams, and flashing police lights had long since faded, leaving behind the quiet, enduring majesty of the Rocky Mountains. The physical remnants of Julian Vance Holloway's hidden empire, The reinforced subterranean vaults, the classified corporate ledgers, and the grim archival repositories had been systematically dismantled, cataloged, and locked away inside secure federal repositories. Yet, the cultural and psychological tremors of the investigation continued to ripple across institutional corridors from Washington, D.C. to the sun-bleached desert valleys of Arizona. Inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation's headquarters in the nation's capital, Special Agent Thomas Vance sat at his desk reviewing the final operational implementation reports for the newly established Interstate Alias and Unidentified Identity Task Force. Propelled directly by the public revelations of the Maritime Phantom podcast and the exhaustive forensic audits conducted across the Pacific Northwest, the Southeast, and the Rocky Mountain Corridor, the federal government was fundamentally rewriting the rulebook on how multi-jurisdictional cold cases involving identity laundering were handled. The traditional bureaucratic silos that had allowed predatory criminals like Julian to slip invisibly between state lines, municipal jurisdictions, and unindexed corporate registries for decades were gone. In their place stood a centralized, artificial intelligence-driven analytic grid. This system was designed to cross-reference historical financial ledgers, biometric markers, maritime shipping logs, and missing persons databases in real time, ensuring that no fugitive could ever again hide behind a dead child's birth certificate or a fabricated corporate identity. Thomas closed the heavy manila portfolio, leaned back in his leather chair, and exhaled a long, steady breath. The case that had consumed his professional life, a sprawling, labyrinthine nightmare of corporate deceit and calculated murder, was officially closed. But the institutional memory of what had happened would serve as a permanent warning to the agencies tasked with protecting the public trust. Thousands of miles away, in the small, quiet coastal town of Mendocino, California, the sea air carried the sharp, invigorating scent of salt spray and crushed eucalyptus. Retired Detective Marcus Vance stood on the wooden front porch of his home, a warm mug of black coffee cradled in his calloused hands. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly out to the horizon under a vast, brilliant expanse of afternoon sky. The dark, haunting ghosts that had occupied his desk, his sleep, and his thoughts for nearly 30 years had finally been laid to rest. The cold case file for the Sterling/Miller homicide, along with the extensive documentation linking Arthur Vance and Julian Vance Holloway to the wider Western Syndicate, rested securely in the permanent federal archives, stamped and categorized with a finality that could never be undone. The small cedar shingle home at 742 Whispering Pines Lane, once the tragic, blood-soaked epicenter of an inexplicable coastal nightmare, stood serene and peaceful behind its thick screens of greenery. New owners had painted the shutters a warm cream color, planted vibrant rows of hydrangeas along the front porch, and filled the bright rooms with the cheerful sounds of family life. The dark, violent history of the house had not been erased. No tragedy of that magnitude can ever truly be scrubbed from the earth, but it had been reclaimed. The home was no longer a monument to a ghost. It was a sanctuary once again. Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee, feeling the warm liquid soothe his throat. He reached into the deep pocket of his wool jacket, his fingers brushing against the familiar, worn leather binding of his old investigative notebook. He pulled it out, resting it on the wooden armrest of his porch chair. He didn't open it to the final page where he had written resolved weeks ago. He simply let his hand rest over the cover, feeling the tangible texture of a lifetime spent fighting for those who could no longer speak for themselves. The multi-decade nightmare that had begun on a freezing December night in 1997 and stretched all the way back to the snowy mountain ridges of 1985 was definitively over. The Maritime Phantom was locked away in an inescapable concrete tomb in the Colorado desert, stripped of his aliases, his wealth, and his intellectual pretense. The digital tide had washed away the shadows, and the coast was sleeping in the open, unyielding light of day. Marcus looked up toward the infinite blue horizon where the Pacific met the sky, taking a deep, unburdened breath of the salt-laden air. The story was told. The balance was restored. And for the first time in 3 decades, the world was quiet, steady, and completely at peace. The autumn wind sweeping down through the rugged mountain canyons of Rabun County, Georgia, carried the sharp, damp scent of decaying pine needles and wet red clay on a brisk October morning in 2026. High above the valley floor, tucked away behind a rusted chain-link fence topped with barbed wire and half-concealed by thick stands of mountain laurel and dense brush, stood the abandoned marble quarry. For decades, it had been a local landmark known only to stray hunters and local teenagers looking for a secluded spot away from the winding asphalt of the Blue Ridge backroads. Now, the desolate quarry was the epicenter of a massive, federal excavation site that looked less like a police investigation and more like an archaeological dig at the gates of hell. Heavy industrial excavators sat silent on stabilization pads, their massive hydraulic arms frozen midair above freshly churned red earth. High-intensity portable halogen floodlights cast a brilliant, clinical white glare across the jagged white marble walls of the pit, cutting sharp geometric patterns through the morning mist. Plywood walkways spanned freshly dug trenches where forensic anthropologists, FBI structural engineers, and state crime scene technicians worked with painstaking, millimeter-precision care, using trowels, soft bristle brushes, and dental picks to unearth the hidden architecture of a monster's mind. Following the landmark federal conviction in Seattle, Julian Vance Holloway had finally broken his icy, calculated silence. Faced with an unassailable mountain of forensic evidence and the permanent certainty of a federal supermax incarceration without the possibility of parole, the 74-year-old architect of the Maritime Syndicate had offered a final, grim concession to the United States Department of Justice, the precise geographic coordinates of his underground archival vaults. Not just the primary containment cell discovered months prior, but the foundational, subterranean network he had engineered during the early 1980s across the Southeast, secondary repositories where he believed his earliest specimens would remain undisturbed by the march of human history. Standing on the wooden observation platform overlooking the main excavation pit, retired Detective Marcus Vance adjusted the collar of his heavy wool jacket, watching the silent choreography of the recovery teams below. His breath plumed in the crisp morning air, mixing with the fine, red dust kicked up by the soil sifters. Beside him stood Special Agent Thomas Vance, holding a weather-sealed clipboard containing the surveyor's architectural diagrams recovered from Julian's Oregon estate. He called it his permanent gallery. Agent Vance said quietly, his voice flat and drained of expression as he studied the handwritten blueprints. Look at the structural schematics, Marcus. He didn't just bury them. He engineered these chambers with reinforced concrete bulkheads, industrial-grade moisture barriers, and independent ventilation systems. He intended for these bodies to outlast civilization itself. Marcus looked down into the open trench, where technicians in full hazmat suits and sterile booties were carefully lifting a heavy, custom-welded steel access hatch from a concrete shaft sunk deep into the bedrock. A narcissist doesn't destroy his work, Thomas, Marcus replied, his voice raspy and weathered by decades of confronting human depravity. He curates it. He wanted to be a creator, even if his medium was human life. He thought he was playing a game of chess against time, and that as long as these vaults stayed buried, he was still winning. Well, the game is over, Agent Vance said, gesturing toward the open hatch. The extraction team is about to breach the secondary lower vault. Let's go down. They descended the steep, wooden scaffolding stairs into the belly of the excavation pit, the damp chill of the earth pressing in around them like a physical weight. The air grew noticeably colder and heavier the deeper they went, smelling of stagnant mineral water, ancient concrete, and the unmistakable, hollow scent of long-sealed subterranean space. At the base of the concrete shaft, lead forensic anthropologist Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation to the Portland victim, stood beside a portable triage table illuminated by battery-powered LED work lights. He wore heavy rubber boots caked in red clay and a sterile surgical mask pulled down beneath his chin, his face etched with profound, professional exhaustion. We just breached the primary bulkhead 10 minutes ago, Dr. Thorne said, nodding grimly as Marcus and Thomas approached the edge of the open concrete trench. The environmental sealing held up better than expected. The ambient temperature inside the lower vault stayed around 50 degrees Fahrenheit for over 30 years. It acted like a natural crypt. What did you find? Marcus asked, his jaw tightening as he stared down into the dark, concrete-lined cavity illuminated by the harsh beams of tactical flashlights. Multiple preservation chambers, Dr. Thorne answered, handing them each a pair of sterile gloves and N95 respirators. Separate, isolated steel-frame display units, engineered with chemical preservatives and air filtration locks. He didn't just toss them into a mass grave, detective. He preserved them like museum artifacts. We have recovered the remains of 4 distinct individuals, 2 young women and 2 young men, missing from university towns across North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia between 1981 and 1985. Marcus slipped on the sterile gloves, pulled the respirator over his face, and stepped carefully down the aluminum ladder into the subterranean vault. The interior of the chamber was a chilling monument to methodical madness. The walls were lined with smooth, poured concrete, fitted with recessed copper wiring channels and custom ventilation grates that hummed softly from a temporary generator line running down from the surface. In the center of the room sat 4 stainless steel preservation tables, arranged with mathematical, geometric precision around a central observation desk where a vintage leather-bound ledger and a brass desk lamp rested undisturbed beneath a thin layer of fine white mineral dust. Marcus walked slowly past the metal tables, his eyes tracing the clean, clinical lines of the room. There was no chaos here. No signs of a panic struggle, no frantic damage, no random violence. Everything had been placed according to a strict, internal taxonomy of evil. On the central desk, resting beside an unopened pack of cigarettes from 1983, sat Julian's original handwritten operating manual, a leather-bound journal containing detailed anatomical notes, behavioral observations, and meticulous logs tracking the exact dates, times, and environmental parameters of every single abduction. Marcus reached out with a gloved hand, picking up the journal. He flipped open the heavy cover, his eyes scanning the precise, left-leaning cursive script. There were no emotional outbursts, no demonic rants, no erratic scribblings. Just cold, clinical data points recorded by a man who viewed human beings the way an entomologist views pinned insects in a glass display case. He kept field notes. Special Agent Thomas Vance said quietly, stepping down into the vault beside him, shining his flashlight beam over Marcus's shoulder. Every single victim accounted for. Every date verified. This single ledger completely corroborates every remaining open file across 3 federal jurisdictions. We aren't just closing a cold case anymore, Marcus. We are rewriting the history of missing persons investigations in the American Southeast. It doesn't bring them back, Marcus murmured, his voice muffled slightly by the respirator mask as he closed the leather journal and slid it carefully into a forensic evidence bag held out by a technician. It gives their families a name, a grave, and an end to the 30-year nightmare of not knowing. But the damage he inflicted on the world can never be unmade. Up above, on the rim of the quarry, the morning mist had finally burned off under the bright, uncompromising light of an autumn afternoon. High-definition satellite broadcast vans belonging to major global networks had begun arriving along the access road, their reporters setting up live transmission feeds to beam the historic recovery efforts to millions of viewers across the world. The true crime digital phenomenon sparked by Sarah Lynn's podcast had transformed from a piece of investigative entertainment into a massive, national reckoning on the silent vulnerabilities of transient student populations during the early 1980s and 90s. Across university campuses in Seattle, Portland, Charlottesville, and Atlanta, student unions and civil rights groups were organizing candlelight vigils and memorial foundations named after the recovered victims, Melissa Vance, Sarah Jenkins, Arthur Thorne, and Richard Miller. The institutional wall of silence that had protected Julian Vance Holloway for over 3 decades had been permanently obliterated by the convergence of modern digital media, crowdsourced investigation, and relentless federal forensics. Back in San Francisco, inside her soundproof studio booth, Sarah Lynn sat editing the final, monumental bonus episode of The Maritime Phantom. Her computer screen displayed a complex, glowing digital archive containing thousands of listener messages, memorial tributes, and family thank you letters pouring in from every corner of the globe. She didn't need to write a script for this final episode. The raw audio of the Rabin County quarry excavation, the hum of the generators, the quiet shuffling of footsteps in the subterranean vaults, the steady, rhythmic clicking of forensic cameras, spoke with a power that no human voice could ever replicate. She placed her fingertips gently on the edges of her studio desk, looking out through the acoustic glass at the sunlit skyline of the city where this entire labyrinthine journey had begun nearly a year ago. The monsters of our world do not live in fairy tales or dark, enchanted forests. Sarah spoke softly into her microphone, capturing the final words of the entire documentary series. They live next door. They wear clean suits, teach in quiet classrooms, drink green tea, and smile politely as they walk past us on the street. They rely on our silence, our institutional boundaries, and our willingness to look away when things get too dark to confront. But the moment we refuse to look away, the moment we choose to remember, to question, and to dig beneath the surface, the darkness loses its power. The ghosts are finally home, and the light is here to stay. She hit export. The final audio file rendered with a clean, digital chime, uploading instantly to secure global servers where it would be downloaded by millions of people within the hour. Down in the concrete-vaulted archives of the Mendocino County Courthouse, the physical cardboard box labeled Sterling/Miller homicide was finally removed from the active shelving rack. It was placed inside a permanent, archival steel preservation container, stamped with a final, indelible label, Resolved, Permanent Federal Archive. The coastal fog rolled back across the rugged cliffs of Northern California as evening approached, wrapping the redwoods and the crashing Pacific waves in a blanket of quiet, everlasting peace. The case was closed. The phantom was caged. And the coast could finally sleep in the open light. The iron gates of the United States Penitentiary, Administrative Maximum Facility, known universally as ADX Florence, did not open with a metallic clatter. They groaned with the heavy, pneumatic suction of a subterranean vault ceiling against the vacuum of deep space. Located in the windswept, sun-bleached desert basin of Fremont County, Colorado, where the Rocky Mountains cast jagged, unforgiving shadows across the arid landscape, this was the end of the line. It was a concrete tomb designed to hold the most incorrigible, dangerous, and irredeemable minds produced by modern civilization. On a brilliant, blistering Tuesday afternoon in July of 2026, a nondescript federal transport van rolled slowly past the concentric rings of razor wire, guard towers, and motion-activated security perimeters, coming to a dead stop inside the secure Sally port of Unit H. Inside the van, seated alone on a bolted aluminum bench with his hands cuffed to a heavy belly chain, sat Julian Vance Holloway. He no longer wore the tailored charcoal gray suit that had shielded his dignity during the federal trial in Seattle. He wore standard institutional orange, his frame slightly shrunken, his silver hair cropped close to his scalp by prison barbers. Yet, as the rear doors of the transport van swung open, flooding the dark interior with blinding Colorado sunlight, Julian did not blink. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the horizon, surveying the stark, barren desert landscape with the same clinical, detached curiosity he had once brought to his university lecture halls and his mountain preservation vaults. Federal corrections officers flanked him instantly, their boots striking the concrete with sharp, rhythmic finality. They guided him out of the vehicle through a labyrinth of electronic security doors, biometric retinal scanners, and solid steel barrier gates, escorting him deeper and deeper into the bowels of the Supermax facility. There were no windows here. There was no sound of human laughter, no chatter of television sets, no rustle of autumn leaves. There was only the low, ceaseless hum of industrial ventilation systems pumping filtered air through a maze of soundproofed, 12-foot square isolation cells. Cell 114. The heavy pneumatic door slid open with a hollow hiss. Julian was guided inside. The belly chain was unlocked. The handcuffs slipped away from his wrists through a secure stainless steel slot in the door, and with a heavy, final thud, the steel barrier slammed shut, locking him into a permanent, 23-hour-a-day solitary confinement. He stood alone in the center of the poured concrete room, a concrete slab bed anchored firmly to the floor. A stainless steel combination toilet and sink unit bolted against the wall. A single, narrow vertical slit of a window high up near the ceiling, through which nothing could be seen except a tiny, razor-thin strip of pale blue Colorado sky. Julian walked slowly to the edge of the concrete bunk, sat down, and folded his hands neatly in his lap. He looked around the soundproof room, taking in the absolute, unyielding stillness of his new reality. For a man who had spent decades meticulously constructing an elaborate web of false identities, hidden vaults, and intellectual superiority over the laws of man, this was the ultimate irony. He had spent his life turning human beings into specimens locked away in the dark, and now he had become his own final specimen, cataloged and buried alive by the very system he thought he had outsmarted. He closed his eyes, leaning back against the cold concrete wall, as the silent desert night descended across the Colorado Basin. While Julian Vance Holloway settled into his eternal concrete silence, thousands of miles away across the North American continent, the cultural and institutional shockwaves of his exposure were still reshaping the landscape of American law enforcement. In Washington, D.C., the Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters was in the final stages of drafting a sweeping, nationwide directive known as the Interstate Serial Linkage Initiative. Propelled directly by the public revelations of the Maritime Phantom podcast and the tireless forensic breakthroughs achieved by Agent Thomas Vance and independent auditor Elena Rostova, the Bureau was overhauling how cold cases involving identity-shifting fugitives were tracked, cross-referenced, and investigated. The traditional silos that had allowed predators like Julian to slip between state lines, municipal jurisdictions, and unindexed corporate registries for decades were being systematically dismantled. In their place rose an integrated, artificial intelligence-driven analytic grid capable of cross-referencing historical financial ledgers, biometric markers, maritime shipping logs, and missing persons databases in real time. Inside her soundproof studio in San Francisco, Sarah Lynn stood before her editing console, staring at the raw analytics dashboard of her podcast network. The Maritime Phantom had officially surpassed over 100 million global downloads, breaking every historical record for investigative audio journalism. But the numbers weren't what mattered to Sarah as she stared at the glowing screen. What mattered was the digital inbox below. It was overflowing with thousands of messages from families across the country who had spent decades searching in the dark for missing daughters, brothers, and sisters. Following the exhumations in Rabun County and the positive identification of victims like Melissa Vance and Sarah Jenkins, dozens of other families had come forward, utilizing the public awareness generated by the podcast to reopen dormant local investigations in states from Florida to Maine. The story had stopped being merely a piece of true crime entertainment. It had transformed into a living, breathing instrument of public restitution. A decentralized network of citizen sleuths, forensic scientists, and digital archivists had formed organically across online communities, working collaboratively to shine a flashlight into the forgotten corners of American history. Sarah reached out, tapping the screen to open a new message thread. It was an email from retired Detective Marcus Vance, sent from his home in Mendocino. The email was brief, typed in simple, unformatted text. Sarah, the physical case file for the Sterling/Miller homicide was officially transferred to the permanent federal archives this morning. The county basement is quiet again. The fog is rolling in off the Pacific, heavy and cold, just like it was back in December of '97. But for the first time in 30 years, when I walk past those shelves, the silence doesn't feel heavy. Thank you for making sure the world remembered their names. Marcus. Sarah read the words twice, a quiet, profound sense of closure washing over her. She closed her laptop, walked over to her studio window, and looked out at the brilliant afternoon sun breaking over the San Francisco Bay. The journey that had begun with a rainy November morning in Buckhead, the execution of Marcus Vance, the discovery of Arthur Pendleton, the opening of the Rabun County Vault, and the unmasking of the Symphony abductor had finally reached its ultimate, definitive horizon. Down in Mendocino, the small cedar shingle home at 742, Whispering Pines Lane stood silent behind its dense thickets of eucalyptus and cypress. New owners had moved in years ago, painting the shutters a bright, warm cream color, planting hydrangeas along the front porch, and filling the bright rooms with the sounds of children laughing and music playing softly through open windows. The dark, blood-soaked wool carpet in the master study had long since been torn up, replaced by bright hardwood floors that caught the golden afternoon sunlight streaming in off the ocean. The past had not been erased. No tragedy of that magnitude can ever truly be scrubbed from the earth, but it had been reclaimed. The house was no longer a monument to a ghost. It was a home once again. Out on the rugged headlands overlooking the crashing Pacific surf, the wind blew fierce and clean, sweeping away the last lingering remnants of the mist, leaving the jagged cliffs and the endless blue horizon exposed to the bright, uncompromising light of day. The heavy, suffocating silence of the high desert basin in Fremont County, Colorado, was broken only by the low, mechanical hum of perimeter sensors and the distant, rhythmic whistle of a freight train crawling across the arid plains far beyond the razor-wire perimeter of ADX Florence. Inside cell 114 of Unit H, time had ceased to be measured by the rising and setting of the sun. There were no windows to mark the change of seasons, no shifting shadows across the poured concrete floor, and no sound of human voices to pierce the absolute, soundproof void. Julian Vance Holloway sat motionless on the edge of his steel-anchored bunk, his posture rigidly erect, his pale blue eyes fixed on the blank, gray-painted concrete wall directly across from him. For months, the intellectual architect of the Maritime Syndicate had maintained his mental fortress, retreating inward into the vast, complex archives of his own formidable memory. He had replayed every financial transaction, every architectural blueprint, every meticulously planned operation that spanned 4 decades across the American continent. Yet, despite his best efforts to maintain cognitive discipline, a quiet, corrosive realization had begun to take hold within the deep recesses of his mind. The system he had spent his entire life building, the invisible empire of shell corporations, offshore bank accounts, maritime logistics networks, and reinforced subterranean vaults, had not merely been disrupted, it had been utterly, permanently erased. The physical evidence he had so carefully curated in Rabun County, the Roosevelt National Forest, and the Oregon coastal estates had been dragged out of the dark, cataloged by federal scientists, and displayed before a global public that now knew his true name, his face, and the full extent of his psychopathic depravity. He was no longer the brilliant, untouchable phantom of coastal legend. He was just an old man in an orange jumpsuit, trapped in a concrete box, forgotten by the world he thought he could manipulate. Julian reached down with trembling fingers, touching the cold metal frame of his cot. His mind drifted back, not to the grand architectural designs of his youth or the sprawling maritime estates, but to a cold, rainy November night in Boulder, Colorado, back in 1985. He remembered the sharp, metallic tang of fear in the air, the sound of glass breaking, and the terrified expression on Clara Vance's face as she realized that her husband's business partner had come to collect an unpayable debt. At the time, Clara's execution had seemed like a minor, necessary administrative adjustment, a loose thread tied off to protect the integrity of the larger design. He had never imagined that 41 years later, that single loose thread would unravel his entire kingdom, bringing down a multi-state criminal syndicate through the relentless, unyielding persistence of a retired detective and a federal investigator. Julian closed his eyes, leaning his head back against a cold concrete wall. For the first time in his life, the silence of the room did not feel like a triumph of isolation. It felt like an eternal, inescapable tomb. Thousands of miles away, on the rugged, windswept coast of Northern California, the morning fog rolled in thick and heavy off the Pacific Ocean, casting a soft, pearlescent veil over the redwoods and the rocky headlands of Mendocino. Retired Detective Marcus Vance stood on the wooden front porch of his home, a warm mug of black coffee cradled in his calloused hands. The air was crisp, laden with a sharp, clean scent of salt spray and wet eucalyptus leaves. He looked out past the line of towering cypress trees toward the endless horizon where the gray ocean met the sky. The heavy, suffocating weight that had anchored itself to his soul for nearly 30 years was entirely gone. The active case files were closed, the federal archives were sealed, and the names of Clara Vance, Melissa Vance, Sarah Jenkins, and all the forgotten victims of the syndicate had been permanently restored to history with dignity, honor, and truth. Marcus took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He reached into the deep pocket of his wool jacket, his fingers brushing against the familiar, worn leather binding of his old investigative notebook. He pulled it out, letting it rest for a moment on the wooden porch railing. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The final page had long been written, stamped, and filed away. Yet, as he looked out across the sunlit expanse of the Pacific, he knew that the true victory belonged not to the detectives, the federal agents, or the courtrooms, but to the memory of those who had refused to let the darkness win. "You can rest now, Clara," Marcus whispered softly into the quiet morning air, his voice carrying away on the coastal breeze. Down in Boulder, Colorado, beneath the deep shade of a towering oak tree on the university campus, the bronze memorial plaque dedicated to Clara Vance caught the first golden rays of the morning sun. Students walked past the monument with quiet reverence, occasionally stopping to read the inscription etched into the polished granite. In memory of Clara Vance, 1947 to 1985. Educator, scholar, and guardian of truth. The truth cannot be buried forever. The light will always find its way home. Across the nation, across university lecture halls, federal investigative agencies, and millions of digital listening devices worldwide, the legacy of the investigation lived on as a permanent testament to the power of human vigilance. The digital documentary series The Maritime Phantom had concluded its broadcast run, but its impact had forever altered the landscape of true crime journalism, institutional accountability, and cold case forensics. Inside her soundproof studio booth in San Francisco, Sarah Lynn sat back in her chair, staring at her empty workstation monitor. The audio files were rendered, the global servers were updated, and the digital archives were locked. Her role as the narrator of the sprawling saga had reached its natural, definitive conclusion. She stood up, walked over to the large glass window of her studio, and looked out over the sparkling expanse of the San Francisco Bay. The morning sun was breaking brightly through the dispersing fog, washing the city in a warm, unyielding radiance. The long, dark night that had stretched from the snowy mountain ridges of 1985 to the coastal cliffs of Mendocino was finally over. The multi-decade nightmare of the Maritime Phantom was buried in the desert dust, his secrets exposed to the light, and his empire reduced to a forgotten whisper in the wind. The coast was clear. The world was at peace. And the light had finally found its way home. The high-altitude summer sun of July 2026 beat down relentlessly on the arid, windswept plains of Fremont County, Colorado, baking the cracked earth and casting stark, sharp-edged shadows across the razor-wire perimeters of the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility. Inside the subterranean depths of Unit H, time had long since lost its meaning. There were no clocks, no shifting daylight through windows, and no sounds of the outside world, only the relentless, mechanical hum of industrial air filtration systems and the occasional heavy thud of a pneumatic security door sliding shut in the distance. In cell 114, Julian Vance Holloway sat motionless on his bolted concrete bunk. His posture remained rigidly upright, his hands resting flat against his knees beneath the harsh, unyielding glare of recessed overhead LED panels that stayed illuminated 24 hours a day. The brilliant intellectual architecture that had once commanded a multi-state criminal enterprise, orchestrated complex corporate shell networks, and curated subterranean vaults filled with human artifacts had been systematically dismantled down to its absolute foundation. He had spent his final years believing that his mind was an unassailable fortress, that his wealth and foresight placed him entirely beyond the reach of human law. Now, enclosed within 12 square feet of poured concrete and reinforced steel, he was living proof of the absolute futility of that delusion. Every strategy, every forged alias, every carefully calculated execution had ultimately led to this single, inescapable room. The federal Supermax facility had not just imprisoned his physical body, it had buried his legacy alive. His name, Once whispered in elite corporate boardrooms and hidden maritime circles as a phantom of untouchable power, was now synonymous with institutional cowardice, calculated depravity, and the inevitable triumph of historical truth. Julian closed his eyes, his pale blue gaze turning inward. For the first time in his life, there were no new blueprints to draft, no financial ledgers to balance, and no alibis to construct. There was only the quiet, crushing realization that the darkness he had engineered for others had finally closed in around him permanently. Thousands of miles away, across the varied landscapes of the American continent, the profound ripples of the investigation's conclusion continued to transform the institutions of justice, journalism, and public memory. In Washington, D.C., the Department of Justice officially codified the Interstate Serial Linkage Initiative, a permanent, multi-jurisdictional federal task force born directly from the ashes of the Clara Vance cold case and the exposure of the Maritime Syndicate. The bureaucratic walls that had allowed predatory criminals to slip silently between state lines and unindexed municipal archives for decades were gone. In their place stood an advanced, artificial intelligence-driven analytic grid designed to ensure that no missing person could ever be permanently erased from history by an institutional predator. In Boulder, Colorado, the campus of the university where Clara Vance had once taught literature was bathed in the warm, golden light of a midsummer afternoon. Beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree, students and faculty members frequently paused beside the polished bronze memorial plaque. The inscription, "Educator, Scholar, and Guardian of Truth." The truth cannot be buried forever. The light will always find its way home. Had become a permanent touchstone for the community, a reminder that the pursuit of justice and the refusal to forget are among the most powerful forces known to humanity. Further west, on the rugged, wave-battered headlands of Mendocino, California, the Pacific breeze swept across the open ocean, carrying the clean, sharp scent of salt spray and eucalyptus. Retired Detective Marcus Vance stood on the wooden front porch of his home, a warm mug of coffee in his hands, looking out toward the endless horizon. The heavy, suffocating weight that had haunted his professional life and personal peace for nearly 30 years had entirely vanished. The active case files were locked away in permanent federal archives, stamped and categorized with a finality that could never be undone. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest, not in darkness and silence, but in the open, unyielding light of day. Marcus reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the worn leather binding of his old investigative notebook. He pulled it out, letting it rest for a moment on the wooden railing before closing his hand over it. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The story was told, the balance was restored, and the world was quiet. In her soundproof studio in San Francisco, Sarah Lynn sat back in her chair, gazing out through the acoustic glass at the sunlit skyline of the bay. The Maritime Phantom had completed its historic run, downloading into the hearts and minds of over 100 million listeners worldwide, transforming true crime storytelling into a permanent instrument of historical reckoning and public accountability. The digital inbox had quieted down from its frantic peak, replaced by a steady stream of gratitude from families whose missing loved ones had finally been recovered, identified, and brought home. Sarah knew her role as the narrator of this monumental saga had reached its natural, definitive end. She saved her final project file, locked the master audio servers, and turned off her mixing board. The long, dark night that had stretched across 4 decades, from the freezing mountain ridges of 1985 to the coastal cliffs of Northern California, was officially over. The Maritime Phantom was locked away in an inescapable concrete tomb in the desert, his secrets exposed, his empire reduced to dust. The coast was clear, the world was at peace, and the light had finally, permanently found its way home. Part 13. The morning fog that rolled off the freezing expanse of the Pacific Ocean during the late summer of 2026 did not cling to the Mendocino coast with its usual heavy, suffocating gloom. Instead, as the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the jagged cliffs and ancient redwood groves, the mist parted cleanly, dissolving before a brilliant, unobstructed blaze of golden sunlight. It was a rare, pristine atmospheric clarity, the kind that made the ocean horizon look infinite, sharp, and entirely unveiled. Retired Detective Marcus Vance stood motionless on the weathered cedar boards of his front porch, his heavy wool jacket zipped to his chin against the lingering morning chill. In his calloused hands, he cradled a ceramic mug of black coffee, the steam rising in thin, delicate spirals before vanishing into the crisp air. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, his shoulders were unburdened by the phantom weight of unfinished business. The steel filing cabinets in the basement precinct back in Boulder were locked and emptied of their ghosts. The federal archives in Denver were sealed with the final, unyielding stamps of federal jurisprudence, and the man who had orchestrated a continent-spanning syndicate from the shadows was buried alive beneath the burning desert sands of Fremont County, Colorado. Marcus took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, letting the bitter warmth ground him in the present. He turned his gaze away from the crashing surf and looked down at the small, sturdy house at 742, Whispering Pines Lane. The new owners had spent the summer painting the trim a bright, welcoming cream, clearing away the overgrown brush beneath the front windows and planting vibrant boxes of red geraniums along the porch steps. The deep, visceral trauma that had once soaked into the very foundation of the property had not magically vanished. History cannot simply be edited out of existence, but it had been completely overwritten by life. The house was no longer a monument to a terrifying, unsolved mystery. It was a home, breathing and alive under the open sky. He reached slowly into the deep pocket of his coat, his fingers brushing against the familiar, worn leather binding of his old investigative notebook. For 30 years, that book had been his Bible, his compass, and his curse. Every frantic phone number, every diagram of a crime scene, every dark hypothesis scrawled under the harsh fluorescent glare of a precinct desk lamp was captured within its yellowed pages. He pulled the notebook halfway out, feeling the rough texture of the spine, then slid it back down into his pocket. He didn't need to open it anymore. The final entry had been written weeks ago. The case was closed. The ledger was balanced. Yet, as Marcus looked out toward the endless blue of the Pacific, he knew that the true legacy of the 1985 Clara Vance investigation and the harrowing unraveling of Julian Vance Holloway's maritime syndicate extended far beyond his own personal closure. It was woven into the very fabric of how modern society confronts institutional evil, corporate arrogance, and the quiet vulnerabilities of the forgotten dead. Thousands of miles away, in the heart of the nation's capital, the impact of the investigation had permanently altered the operational architecture of American law enforcement. Inside the Department of Justice headquarters, the newly codified Interstate Serial Linkage Initiative was operating at full capacity. Across federal, state, and local jurisdictions, the old, insular bureaucratic silos that had allowed predatory criminals like Julian to slip invisibly across state lines for decades were gone. In their place stood an advanced, artificial intelligence-driven analytic grid, a centralized digital nervous system capable of cross-referencing historical financial ledgers, unindexed corporate shell registries, biometric markers, and missing persons files in real time. The era of the untouchable corporate predator hiding behind layers of offshore wealth and falsified identities was effectively over. The digital age had finally caught up with the shadows. In Boulder, Colorado, the morning sunlight was beginning to filter through the heavy canopy of the ancient oak tree on the university campus, casting dappled, golden patterns across the bronze memorial plaque dedicated to Clara Vance. Students and faculty members walked past the monument with quiet, respectful reverence, occasionally pausing to read the clean, permanent lettering etched into the polished granite. In memory of Clara Vance, 1947 to 1985. Educator, scholar, and guardian of truth. The truth cannot be buried forever. The light will always find its way home. The memorial had become more than just a local landmark. It had transformed into a national symbol of institutional accountability and historical reclamation. Every semester, literature classes gathered beneath the sprawling oak branches to discuss Clara's scholarly contributions and the profound courage it took to stand against corruption when the world was looking the other way. The systemic silence that Julian Vance Holloway had engineered to protect his empire had been completely shattered, replaced by an enduring culture of radical transparency and public vigilance. Further north, in the digital archives of San Francisco, the reverberations of the historical true crime documentary phenomenon The Maritime Phantom were still being felt across global academic and journalistic communities. Though the final bonus audio episodes had been released weeks ago, locking the master servers into permanent public access, the podcast's cultural footprint continued to expand. It was now studied in university journalism programs as a masterclass in ethical investigative storytelling, long-form audio production, and the power of crowdsourced digital archival research. Inside her soundproof studio booth, Sarah Lynn sat back in her ergonomic chair, staring out through the thick acoustic glass at the sunlit skyline of the San Francisco Bay. Her desk was clear of the frantic stacks of physical documents, witness transcripts, and audio mixing decks that had buried her workspace for the better part of a year. The massive global digital archive of listener responses, family thank you letters, and crowdsourced cold case tips had been safely migrated to a secure, permanent university research repository, ensuring that the exhaustive work done by her team would serve future generations of historians and investigators. Sarah picked up her coffee mug, took a quiet sip, and smiled to herself. When she first stumbled upon the faded newspaper clipping regarding the 1985 Boulder cold case, she had anticipated a standard, self-contained investigative podcast about a forgotten local tragedy. She could never have imagined that she was pulling the single loose thread of a sprawling, multi-decade criminal conspiracy involving corporate embezzlement, maritime syndicates, hidden mountain vaults, and an intellectual psychopath who viewed human lives as mere specimens to be filed away in the dark. The journey had tested every ounce of her professional endurance, forcing her to navigate corporate intimidation, institutional stonewalling, and the crushing emotional weight of human grief. But as she looked out at the bright, glittering waters of the bay, she knew it was all worth it. The podcast had transcended entertainment. It had become an instrument of restitution, giving names back to the nameless, graves back to the lost, and peace back to the families who had spent a lifetime living in the dark. She reached out, gently tapping her workstation keyboard to put the system into sleep mode. The screens faded to a soft, uniform black. Her work here was finished. The story had been told from its earliest roots in the winter snows of Colorado to its final, inescapable conclusion in the concrete tombs of the Colorado desert. Far out in the arid, sun-bleached expanse of Fremont County, Colorado, inside the maximum security bowels of ADX Florence, Unit H remained locked in its eternal, soundproof silence. In cell 114, Julian Vance Holloway sat motionless on his bolted concrete bunk. The harsh, unyielding LED panels overhead cast a flat, shadowless white light across his orange jumpsuit and his rigidly upright posture. He no longer spoke. He no longer paced the narrow 12-square-foot perimeter of his cell. He simply sat, an ancient, shrunken artifact of his own making, utterly abandoned by the world he had once believed he could control. The reinforced subterranean vaults in Rabun County and the Roosevelt National Forest were empty, their grim contents exhumed, analyzed, and returned to their rightful resting places. The corporate shell companies had been dissolved, their assets seized by federal restitution funds. The empire of the Maritime Phantom had been reduced to fine, worthless dust scattered across the pages of federal court indictments. Julian raised his head slightly, his pale blue eyes staring directly at the blank, gray concrete wall across from him. There were no blueprints left to draft. There were no alibis left to fabricate. The silence of the Supermax facility pressed in around him with the crushing, absolute finality of a closing vault door. He was entirely alone, a ghost trapped inside a cage of his own design, forgotten by history except as a cautionary tale of what happens when a brilliant mind completely abandons its humanity. Back on the rugged cliffs of Mendocino, the morning sun finally broke fully through the last lingering tendrils of coastal fog, flooding the sprawling landscape with a warm, golden, unyielding radiance. Retired Detective Marcus Vance stepped off his front porch and walked slowly down the gravel pathway toward the edge of the headlands. The wind whipped lightly at his jacket, carrying the crisp, invigorating scent of the open ocean. He stood at the very precipice of the cliff, looking out where the dark blue waves crashed against the ancient, weathered rocks below, sending plumes of brilliant white spray high into the air. He reached into his pocket one last time, pulled out his weathered leather notebook, and held it in the palm of his hand. He looked down at the scuffed, water-stained cover, a silent witness to decades of heartache, frustration, relentless pursuit, and ultimate vindication. With a calm, deliberate motion, Marcus let his hand fall to his side, sliding the notebook back into the deep pocket of his coat. He didn't throw it away, and he didn't open it. He simply kept it with him as a quiet reminder of the road he had traveled. He turned his back to the ocean, took one final, deep, unburdened breath of the clean coastal air, and walked slowly back up the path toward his home. The multi-decade nightmare that had begun on a freezing November night in 1985 was officially, permanently, and irrevocably over. The maritime phantom was caged in the desert dust. The hidden vaults were dragged out of the dark. The lost were finally brought home. And across the sprawling, beautiful expanse of the American landscape, the world was quiet, steady, and completely at peace under the open sky. The late afternoon sun of August 2026 hung low over the high desert of Fremont County, Colorado, casting long, sharp shadows across the razor-wire perimeters and concrete monoliths of the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility. Inside the subterranean isolation of Unit H, the atmospheric pressure remained artificially controlled, humming with the steady, drone-like frequency of industrial ventilation systems that knew neither day nor night. In cell 114, Julian Vance Holloway sat in absolute stillness on the edge of his anchored concrete bunk. The stark, unblinking glare of the overhead LED panels cast a flat, shadowless light across his orange institutional uniform. For months, the once brilliant architect of an interstate criminal syndicate had retreated into the impenetrable fortress of his own memory, turning over the pieces of a life meticulously engineered to outsmart human law. Yet, the fortress had long since crumbled into dust. There were no more blueprints to draft, no shell corporations to manipulate, and no hidden archival vaults left to cure it. Every physical trace of the maritime syndicate, from the cold concrete chambers buried deep within the Roosevelt National Forest to the marble quarry repositories of Rabun County, had been systematically breached, inventoried, and permanently dismantled by federal forensic teams. The multi-decade illusion of untouchable power had evaporated, leaving behind a sterile, 12-foot square isolation cell and an unyielding, inescapable reality. He was a ghost buried alive by the very system he had sought to subvert. Julian raised his gaze toward the narrow vertical slit of a window high up near the ceiling. Through the thick, tinted glass, nothing was visible except a razor-thin strip of pale blue evening sky fading into the deepening violet of the desert night. For a man who had spent a lifetime believing that intellect, wealth, and absolute control could elevate him above the moral boundaries of humanity, this quiet, permanent erasure was the ultimate, unmerciful sentence. Thousands of miles away, across the varied landscapes of the American continent, the profound cultural and institutional aftershocks of the investigation's conclusion continued to reshape the framework of modern society. In Washington, D.C., the Department of Justice finalized the nationwide rollout of the Interstate Serial Linkage Initiative. Born directly from the crucible of the Clara Vance cold case and the exposure of the maritime syndicate, this advanced, artificial intelligence-driven analytic grid permanently bridged the historical, bureaucratic silos that had allowed predators to slip silently between state lines and unindexed municipal archives for decades. The era of the invisible corporate fugitive hiding behind falsified identities and dead child birth certificates was definitively over. In Boulder, Colorado, the university campus where Clara Vance had once taught literature remained bathed in the warm, golden light of late summer. Beneath the sweeping, ancient branches of the campus oak tree, students and faculty members frequently paused beside the polished bronze memorial plaque. The inscription, "Educator, Scholar, and Guardian of Truth." The truth cannot be buried forever. The light will always find its way home, had become a permanent touchstone for the community, a daily reminder that the pursuit of justice and the refusal to let institutional evil fester in the dark are among the most powerful forces known to humanity. Further west, on the rugged, wave-battered headlands of Mendocino, California, the Pacific breeze swept across the open ocean, carrying the clean, sharp scent of salt spray and eucalyptus. Retired Detective Marcus Vance stood on the wooden front porch of his home, a warm mug of coffee cradled in his calloused hands, looking out toward the endless horizon where the deep blue water met the sky. The heavy, suffocating weight that had anchored itself to his professional life and personal peace for nearly 30 years had entirely vanished. The active case files were locked away in permanent federal archives, stamped and categorized with a finality that could never be undone. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest, not in darkness and silence, but in the open, unyielding light of day. Marcus reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the worn leather binding of his old investigative notebook. He pulled it out, letting it rest for a moment on the wooden railing before closing his hand over it. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The story was told, the balance was restored, and the world was quiet. In her soundproof studio in San Francisco, Sarah Lynn sat back in her chair, gazing out through the acoustic glass at the sunlit skyline of the bay. The Maritime Phantom had completed its historic run, downloading into the hearts and minds of over 100 million listeners worldwide, transforming true crime storytelling into a permanent instrument of historical reckoning and public accountability. The digital inbox had quieted down from its frantic peak, replaced by a steady stream of gratitude from families whose missing loved ones had finally been recovered, identified, and brought home. Sarah knew her role as the narrator of this monumental saga had reached its natural, definitive end. She saved her final project file, locked the master audio servers, and turned off her mixing board. The long, dark night that had stretched across 4 decades, from the freezing mountain ridges of 1985 to the coastal cliffs of Northern California, was officially over. The Maritime Phantom was locked away in an inescapable concrete tomb in the desert, his secrets exposed, his empire reduced to dust. The coast was clear, the world was at peace, and the light had finally, permanently found its way home. Part 15. The late afternoon sun of August 2026 cast long, uncompromising shadows across the jagged, sun-baked landscape of Fremont County, Colorado. Outside the razor-wire perimeters of the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, the arid desert winds swept across the barren plains, carrying the distant, low-frequency rumble of interstate traffic and the mechanical hum of security sensors. Deep within the subterranean heart of Unit H, however, the outside world did not exist. There was no weather, no changing light, and no passage of seasons, only the perpetual, low-frequency drone of industrial ventilation systems pumping sterile air through a maze of soundproof isolation cells. In Cell 114, Julian Vance Holloway sat motionless on the edge of his bolted concrete bunk. The harsh, unblinking glare of the overhead LED panel cast a flat, shadowless light across his orange institutional uniform and his rigidly upright posture.